project. Engaging involving Iyal University and the Universities of Lincoln and Nottingham. His postgraduate supervisions. He has supervised a successful doctoral thesis on early children.
Vanakkam from Tamil Nadu, India. I hope each and every one of you are safe at home, given the conditions of the pandemic, as well as the lockdown being extended for another month. I think this doesn't come as a shock to us because this has become the new normal. Amidst living with a deadly disease and trying to accommodate yourself to the new normal, I really commend those people who have concerned themselves with becoming better academicians even in this time of the pandemic. Well, I think everyone knows the purpose of this particular occasion, and I needn't say anything more about the great poet that we are going to celebrate today. And before we could go ahead with this amazing webinar, I hope to begin this with an auspicious start with the Tamil Kai Valli. And we have a great webinar in store for us. We have two amazing speakers who would throw so much insight into the topic of the poet as well as the romantic age. And as we have advertised earlier, we are going to showcase some of the best poets who have submitted their poems in our poetry contest. I hope this will be another great webinar from Kamraj College, Thoothukudi. And to begin this, I do not see a better way than to read out a poem that would best suit the great poet, one of the greatest poets of English literature, William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. And to start off this webinar, I would like to ask Mrs. M. Shamala, Head of the Department of English, SF, Kamraj College, Thuthukudi, to offer you the address of welcome. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Prem. Good afternoon, everyone. A hearty welcome to the international webinar. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel David from Madras Christian College. Welcome, sir, the resourcing session. It's nice to have you among us. I wholeheartedly welcome the principal, Dr. Nagarajan, and Dr. Tony Melvin, the director of the self-financing stream. My best wishes to the organizers of the webinar. I welcome the participants from various colleges, universities, and overseas. Thank you and welcome once again. Thank you, Prem.
Thank you, ma'am. What more could be said to give an introduction to such a great webinar, which commemorates the 250th birth anniversary of the great poet William Wordsworth. And over to the first session, which will be taken over by Professor Daniel David. And in order to give him a formal introduction, I would like to call upon Mrs. Mary Josephine Jarina, Assistant Professor, Department of English, SF, Kamraj College, to give an enchanting felicitation. Over to you, ma'am.
We are in the fullest of joys to inform you that this year is the 250th commemoration of William Wordsworth. I take this moment to introduce to you Professor Daniel David, Head of the Department of English, SFS, Madras Christian College, Chennai from Tamil Nadu, India. It is an opportunity and a blessing to be in the presence of such an eminent scholar like Professor David, who has about 26 years of teaching experience. His contribution to the field of literature is a valuable treasure. He can be best identified as a man of humility and composure. Professor David is well versed in the fields of narratology, fantastic fiction, practical theatre, and critical theory. He has several national and international publications to his name. The following session will be a profound contribution to the study of the Romantic Age. With cordial sincerity, I welcome the guest speaker of the hour, Professor Daniel David, to commence his wonderful talk. We are in
And now it's time for the first session of the webinar, which will be taken over by Professor Daniel David. And over to you, sir. Hope we will all have a very interesting session for today.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Department of English of Kamraj College and particularly Professor Shasikala and her team, who have brought this webinar into fruition. And I find it a little strange that we are talking about the Romantic Age, the Romantic movement, and about William Wordsworth using cutting-edge technology. And this is the first time I'm on this platform, and I hope this goes off well. Thank you very much for being part of this webinar. To begin, I have to first of all tell you the modus operandi that I'm going to follow. Now, the gentleman who introduced this whole session started off by reading Daffodils by William Wordsworth. Now, that is something that I'm not going to do. I'm not going to be quoting from Wordsworth's poems. I'm going to deal with the themes, the thematics, and what I hope to do in the process. I have an agenda, and the agenda that I have is this. I hope that will incite you to go back and read some of the poems of Wordsworth that you probably have not encountered. Very, very vital poems which you have not encountered. Most of us are used to things like Solitary Reaper, probably Lucy Gray, Daffodils, and so on. but there's so much more to Wordsworth, and I hope that I would be able to entice you by giving you or whetting your appetite, your intellectual appetite through this webinar, to encourage you to go back and read them, at least to verify whether what I'm saying is right or not. So having said that, now, first of all, this is pretty elementary, but let's get this clear. Now, the terminology. Now, the word romantic movement, the romantic age, refers to the 19th century and a group of very, very important intellectuals and creative artists, a booming of, creative activity that happened both in England and in Germany during the 19th century. Now, we have to distinguish this, first of all, from the Romance. The Romance is a subgenre of narrative poetry that came more than 500 years before the Romantic movement. So that is something that has to be kept in mind. And also, Romance here, or Romantic here, has nothing to do with the Romance family of languages, which are languages like French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, which came out of Latin. So having made that clear, let's get into the Romantic movement and particularly into William Wordsworth. The system that I would be following would be moving from the general to the particular. Now, first of all, let me mention the secondary sources that I have been using. The greatest scholar on William Wordsworth perhaps ever is, of course, M.H. Abrams. The key book, The Mirror and the Lamp, and more importantly, his more recent book called Natural Supernaturalism. This is one of the prime sources that I will be using in the course of this talk. The other important books, of course, are Sir Maurice Bowrer's book called Romantic Imagination, and the Oxford Lectures of A.C. Bradley, and so on. These are the primary texts. And I will be using, these are the secondary texts. And I will be using one particular essay written by my good friend and teacher, Dr. Nirmal Selvamani, retired from Madras Christian College, and who is also the head of the Department of English in the Central University in Tiruvarur. And he has written an essay called Communitas Harmonia, which deals with the community aspect of William Wordsworth. And that is something that I have used as well. One other secondary source, which I think if you could access would be brilliant for you, is a series of documentaries that was made by BBC4 called The Romantics. It's simply called The Romantics. And that is something that would be not only entertaining, but very, very highly informative in understanding William Wordsworth, as well as the other Romantics. And I have made extensive use of that as well. Now, one or two things that have to be clarified before we go into a talk on the Romantic age. Misunderstandings, misunderstandings, at least as I think of them now from my student days. First of all, the Romantic movement was not a reaction to the neoclassical movement that went before. In fact, some of the Romantic poets, including William Wordsworth, were great admirers of the neoclassical poets. So it was not really a reaction. So that is one thing. The second thing is this. Now, though the Romantic poets talk so much about urbanization and the hazards of urbanization and so on, it is not a reaction to industrialism. That is another aspect that we have to keep in mind, along with the current idea that the Romantic movement is basically against science. That is not true. A little known fact, one of William Wordsworth's very, very good friends, William Wordsworth's and Coleridge's very good friends, was perhaps the greatest chemist that England produced in that milieu, the person called Humphrey Davy. He's a chemist, and he was one of the most important chemists that England has ever produced. And Humphrey Davy, in fact, Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the one who coined that word scientist. And the word scientist was coined by the Romantic poet Coleridge to describe his friend Humphrey Davy. The current words before that were words like science man, man of science, and so on. But it was the word scientist which had been coined by Coleridge to describe his friend Humphrey Davy that stuck. One other thing that I have to mention. Now, anytime I value papers in which anybody writes about William Wordsworth, the first sentence that I get is William Wordsworth was the greatest nature poet, or was a great nature poet. Now, we have to unpack that expression, nature poet, and we shall do that in the course of this talk. But before I do anything else, I would like to place William Wordsworth in his context. Now, I told you that that M.H. Abrams is the greatest scholar perhaps ever on the Romantic age. But whether it is in The Mirror and the Lamb or in Natural Supernaturalism, M.H. Abrams deals with the Romantic age and the Romantic movement, particularly William Wordsworth in Natural Supernaturalism, in the restricted sense of Britain. And within the 19th century. Now, I would like to extend that far, far deeper into a system of thought that is there inherent in us. And for this, I would like to go back to prehistoric times, when the reaction of human beings to the natural world around them, as well as to natural phenomena, was completely different from what we see today. What we see today is what we might call cognitive thinking. And this is something which came much later. Now, before the cognitive thinking, as we understand it, came into being, what was there really was what one scholar called Frankfurt, Professor and Mrs. Frankfurt, in the book called Before Philosophy, have called an I-thou relationship. Now, thou is elevated. It is the kind of expression that you would get in the King James Version of the Bible. And the I-thou relationship is a relationship of respect. It is a relationship of experience. So any natural phenomenon or any element in nature was essentially experienced rather than understood or analyzed. And this is what Frankfurt says. Now, this type of experience or knowledge is direct, emotional, and inarticulate. Whereas intellectual knowledge, which came later on, is emotionally indifferent and articulate. Now, the expression of this can be found quite easily in one important writer, and that is Hesiod, the writer of Theogony. Now, if you're going to look at the Theogony, you will notice this. You have the age of the Titans. Now, and that, of course, has been referred to as the Golden Age in Hesiod. But who were the Titans in Greek mythology? Now, the Titans, as has been discussed later in classical times, refer to something more elemental, something more what we might call primeval, something which is raw energy. That is what they stood for. And that is how people understood natural phenomena. It was a direct experience rather than an understanding. And later on, if you're going to look, for instance, at the friezes in Pergamon in Turkey, you will see the War of the Titans. And in the War of the Titans with the Olympians, you will notice this, that it is a war between rationality, order, and so on, as against raw elemental energy. Now, this element in Greek thought and in culture was expressed in the form of Dionysus. Now, scholars like Ruth Benedict, the writer of the book called Patterns of Culture, talk about this distinction. the distinction between the raw energy of the Titans and the rationalized, controlled, decorous way of thinking of the Olympians. And this is what is exemplified in in the cult of Apollo much later on. And there, with the classical age and with the involvement of the natural philosophers, people starting with Thales, we get into a set of dichotomies. The dichotomies that M.H. Abrams refers to, the dichotomies that M.H. Abrams refers to as subject-object, ego, non-ego, the human mind or consciousness and its transactions with nature. Now, basically what happens is this: when you have scientific thinking, you need rationality, and you need the subject-object relationship. That becomes absolutely essential. So the I-thou relationship between human beings and nature and natural phenomena is now replaced by I-it, I the other. And this would go down into its repercussions, and its percolations would go into a number of various cultural phenomena, including the recognized community and the non-recognized community, which people consider to be barbarian. And you will get that between the genders and so on. Now, this dichotomy played itself out, has played itself out, it still is playing itself out right through human culture. And we find that reflected. Now, remember, the proponents of the primitive cultures before the classical were the bards. They were communal beings. They were, and the word bard is going to play such an important part in the rest of this talk. Now, this dichotomy carried over into the medieval age. Now, I want to make one thing clear. There is nothing called a dark age. In today's scholarship, there is nothing called a dark age. So the period between 410 CE coming down to 1066 CE, being called the dark age is a misnomer, because that was a time of intense artistic, cultural, philosophical, even to a degree scientific thinking. So we don't call that dark age anymore. It is simply the medieval age. So in the medieval age, the kind of oral tradition that you had, songs like Beowulf, for instance, or Sir Orfeo, or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, all these will come under that particular system, which is different from the graphic system that would come with the Renaissance. Now, that extends itself into the 18th and 19th centuries. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, in the 18th century, you had the neoclassical period, the period of Enlightenment. And then that was followed by the Romantic age. Now, so the Romantic age in itself, the Romantic experience, and this is vital. If you don't understand this, you're never going to understand Wordsworthian poetry. The Wordsworthian consciousness goes back to that primeval consciousness of relating to nature as I, thou, as experiencing nature rather than trying to understand nature. So that is Wordsworth. That is the Wordsworthian experience. And of course, this can be played out in other poets and other writers of the same time. But having said that, having fixed Wordsworth and the Romantic poets in that long hallway of history, let's get back to the current context. Now, Wordsworth and the Romantics were actually voices of their Zeitgeist, of the spirit of that particular age. They were voices. And that is something that has to be remembered. And this was a European phenomenon which spilled over into the Atlantic, across the Atlantic. This is something that we have to keep in mind. Now, what M.H. Abrams says is absolutely true. Now, let me read to you a portion from his preface to Natural Supernaturalism. In England and Germany, two great Protestant nations with a history of theological and political radicalism, the biblical culture fostered collateral developments of response to what Shelley called the great events of the age, by which he meant above all the French Revolution, its unbounded promise and its failure, and the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary shockwaves it had set up in that era of the turbulent emergence of the modern political, social, and industrial world. Philosophers like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, imaginative writers from Blake and Wordsworth to Shelley and the young Carlyle in England, and Hölderlin and Novalis in Germany, as well as others who, like Schiller and Coleridge, were equally metaphysicians and bards, conceived themselves as elected spokesmen for the Western tradition at a time of profound cultural crisis. They represented themselves in the traditional persona of the philosopher seer. Now, there we have to include William Wordsworth. He saw himself as a philosopher seer as well, or the bard prophet. In England, the chief model was Milton, the great bard of what Shelley called the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. And they set out in various yet recognizably parallel ways to reconstitute the grounds of hope and to announce the certainty, or at least the possibility, of the rebirth in which a renewed mankind will inhabit a renovated earth where he will find himself thoroughly at home. So we are referring here to a Zeitgeist which existed not only in England, but also in Germany. And the source of this was tyrannical political social orders and establishments. And the key philosophers here in the 18th century were two French philosophers. The first was Denis Diderot, and the second was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, let me quickly run through this so that you'll understand the polemic systems of thought, and also from where really the English Romantic movement comes. So what we are trying to do is to set the English Romantic movement in its proper cultural context. These two philosophers, Diderot and Rousseau, were very close friends, but their views are polemically opposite each other. Now, Diderot's concept was this: man is born to think for himself. Civilization has supplanted God. With the aid of science and classification, everything could be explained and understood. Now, the spirit of the classical age, classical Greco-Roman age, which started, like I said, with Thales, and then went on to Pythagoras, and then ultimately went down to that compromise that came in with Plato. Now, if you're going to look at that, there are two elements which are vital. One is humanism, and the other is rationality. Now, you'll find both those reflected in this statement of Diderot's. Man is born to think for himself. Now, humanism, the human being as the center, as opposed to biocentricity, where human beings see themselves as just a part of that I-thou relationship. Now, that is the first thing. And the second thing is this: rationality. With the aid of science and classification, everything could be explained and understood. This is the system of thought that evolved out of the classical neo-philosophical age and life. So this is Diderot, but Diametrically opposite to him is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He championed feeling over thought. And let me read to you a few of his statements. To feel is to exist. Feelings come incontestably before our thoughts. Now, that is something that Jacques Lacan would have loved to take on. But anyway, feelings come incontestably before our thoughts. All right. Now, both these people, we have to remember, were preaching freedom. That's part of the topic that I had given. Freedom. Freedom and liberty for the individual. This is what both of them were talking about, though they approached the subject from polemically different points of view. Now, in his book called The Social Contract, written in 1762, this is what Rousseau says. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. This is a sentiment that will be reflected by William Blake later. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And in the book called Emile, this is what he says. Civilized man is born and dies a slave. An infant is bound in swaddling clothes. The corpse is nailed down in a coffin. All his life, man is imprisoned by our institutions. Life is made for the use of our senses, our minds, every part of ourselves. Now, if we do not understand this aspect of Wordsworth, we are never going to understand anything. Because what he is talking about is simply this. The use, Wordsworthian poetry is all about this. The use of our senses. And from the senses, the experience moves into our minds. And when that experience moves into our minds, it moves into every part of ourselves. This is Rousseau. Now, with Rousseau, one thing could be understood, and this is what the Romantic movement in England is all about. Emotion could unlock the prison of civilized society. Now, what do we mean here? Freedom from what? What is this prison we are talking about? The prison that we are talking about is all institutions, is every institution which later on D.H. Lawrence would very clearly delineate. The first of those being society, and what society imposes on us, what society expects from us, and so on. And this is dealt with in much closer detail by the great myth scholar called Joseph Campbell. But what society expects from us, the decorum that society expects from us, and then our education, the way our minds are programmed to think, the way they have to, the way we are expected to think, the decorum that we are supposed to follow in even our thought lives. You see, the most subjective thing that I have is my thought. I think, therefore I am. So that is the most subjective, that's the most personal thing that I have. And civilization in the form of education is something that dominates even that very subjective experience of mine. And the third, of course, is religion, which tells me what to think and what not to think. So this is the establishment. This is, and of course, for Rousseau and for Diderot, that included the political system as well. So we have to fix ourselves in this sociological milieu to be able to understand William Wordsworth along with his intellectual inputs. Now, what the freedom that they were looking for is the freedom of the individual will. And I want you to remember that, please, because individualism is such a vital part of the Romantic movement. So the freedom that lay in the individual will and feeling. And this is another statement which Rousseau made, which I think summarizes the Romantic age. Nature never deceives us. This is what Rousseau said. This is a statement made by Rousseau, which will be quoted later. Nature never deceives us. It is we who deceive ourselves. He believed that man in his natural state is essentially good. Science corrupts, and civilization is a deterrent. And what he believed is this: when human beings group up together, what they do essentially is to corrupt each other. This is what he very firmly believed. So this would be the intellectual, socio-political background from which the Romantic movement comes. It, of course, culminated in the French Revolution. But before it was culminated in the French Revolution, Rousseau made one thing very clear, that this establishment, the system that we have, that existed in France at that time, could not be undone. He had no illusions about that. It could not be undone. So the result is, what he believed was, we need a new world. We need a new world where this freedom that he was talking about could be lived out. And of course, that new world did exist. It did exist across the Atlantic in the United States of America. And that is where one important thinker called Thomas Paine, who wrote the important essay called Common Sense, would echo exactly what Rousseau was talking about. And he would take on the English government, which ultimately led to the American Revolution. But having said that, now it led to the French Revolution, and Wordsworth was so taken up with this concept of liberty, of freedom, that there are different takes on why really Wordsworth went to France. He was certainly not in Paris most of the time when the French Revolution took place. And when somebody like when some scholars tell you that he was there in France simply because he wanted to be close to this phenomenon of getting back freedom. Now, I really do not know how right they are, because he was there for a number of other reasons as well. And one reason that he gave was very simply this: to perfect his knowledge of the French language. But in the process, he fell in love with a French girl called Annette, and he had a daughter by her called Caroline. And if you want to get to know about this and the intense love experience that he had, you'll have to read that vital book by William Wordsworth that most people do not read at all, the book called The Prelude. It's a long book. It is, if you want the Biographia Literaria of William Wordsworth in poetic form. Biographia Literaria is, of course, literary biography. And that would be what The Prelude is to William Wordsworth. And there you get the details of his experience in France, the hope and the longing with which he went to France, the crashing of those hopes, and his love for Annette. Now, he never married Annette, and there are many reasons again which are given for that. But Annette loved him passionately, and he loved her passionately too. But in the again, why did he leave Paris? Why did he leave France? And why did he come back to England? Scholars like Peter Ackroyd in the documentary that I was referring to called The Romantics says that France was hostile to the English, and therefore the English, of course, were anti-republican. And once the French Revolution started, since the British were anti-republican, the French were against the British. Now, I'm not sure again how far that's true, because other scholars believe that he had to leave France primarily because he was broke. He didn't have money. So, and his uncle who had been sending him money stopped. So he went back to England to fall back on his brother Michael. So these are different takes, and I hope that some of you would take up these thorny issues and do more research on them. But anyway, he left France and went back to England. And after that, he had absolutely no contact with Annette, for the simple reason that Annette kept corresponding with him. But in the confusion of the revolution, the letters just didn't reach. And in fact, one of her most intense letters was discovered in 1902. All right. So when he came back to England, one editor and biographer of William Wordsworth called Margoliouth makes the statement. He calls it the triple shock. So what was this triple shock? The first of those triple shocks was the fact that he was separated from his beloved. I think that was the first. The second was that England had declared war on France, and he believed that that was an unjust war, that they should not have declared war, and that they were on the wrong side in the war, that England was on the wrong side in the war. And the third reason was this: he had seen the revolution deteriorate into absolute chaos and into a miasma of violence. This was the period of the reign of the Jacobins, the reign of terror, and Robespierre and others. And with that, his hopes were dashed. His hopes not just for himself, not for himself as an individual, but his hopes for humanity itself had crashed. Now, given the kind of intense person that William Wordsworth was, I tried to understand what really this man went through. It is not the kind of heartbreak that a person goes through when he's separated from his beloved. It's not simply that. The crashing of his hopes was something that had a huge, not just intellectual, but psychological impact on him, for the simple reason that this is something like you're believing in a particular creed, or you're believing in a particular God for most of your life. And ultimately a point comes, probably in your old age, when you're 60 years old or something like that, you've lived your whole life believing in that. And suddenly you realize that it's absolutely false. And the impact that that would have on you would be devastating. And that is what Wordsworth experienced. Now, right through his life, the experience that Wordsworth had had with nature was simply this. It was totally different from what anybody else. Of course, it was biocentric. It was not the kind of subject matter that the neoclassicals were talking about in the form of humanism. It wasn't that. But right from the time he was a small boy, his experience had been what I was discussing a little earlier. It was an experience where in nature, he became part of nature. Now, I would like to draw a parallel here, because as I was reading and trying to do research to find out what really I should compare this with, the only example that I could think of was this. I have often told my students that perhaps the most intense experience that any individual human being could have is falling in love. And the reason for that is this: I have always said that falling in love is perhaps the only human experience where all our six senses are involved. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But I think this is one experience where all our six senses, including our imagination, everything is involved. And I think that was the kind of experience that Wordsworth had with nature, where nature is not experienced. When he talks about the daffodils, which was read to us, he is not just looking at golden daffodils. It's not that. It's something which takes him over. It almost possesses him, till every aspect of his being is saturated with that experience. This is what he had always experienced from the time he was a small boy. And that was what led to his poetry. Now, when he returns from France, devastated and disappointed, he loses that experience with nature. And here, like I said, we have to deal with Wordsworth as a nature poet. So where does nature really come in? And this is something that we will have to refer to. So he went on a tour with a friend of his, and halfway through the tour, it turned out to be a disaster for his friend. So he left, and Wordsworth continued on a walking tour. They're supposed to go on a cart. The cart met an accident, and so his friend had to go back. So he continued walking, and he went to Salisbury, the Salisbury Plain, and of course, he's written a poem called Salisbury Plain. And in Salisbury Plain, all alone, as he always wanted it to be, he was able to reconnect with nature the way he had been able to do as a small boy. So his poetic gift comes back. Now, this is the aspect of nature that I would like to call the redemptive aspect of nature, where Wordsworth is concerned, where he draws him out of absolute despair. He turns from hope in humanity into hope in nature. So that happens, and after that, his intensity of his experience of nature continues. Now, one thing has to be understood here. We are talking about two distinct things. We are talking about experience, and we are talking about expression. All right. Now, the distinction here is this: in the classical mold of thought, it is thought and expression. It is not experience and expression. Now, with the Romantics, and particularly with William Wordsworth, this would be the speciality. His experience, which is converted into expression. And that leads to a few very important aspects of the Romantic movement, which are exemplified so very well, because if you want, William Wordsworth was the spokesperson of the Romantic movement. So some of those characteristics or aspects of the Romantic age, which are so beautifully exemplified in William Wordsworth. Now, the first of those is if you want to summarize the whole of the Romantic age into one word, that word would be imagination. Simply imagination. And that is going to have a huge impact on William Wordsworth and his experience of nature. Now, imagination played a very small part when it came to the neoclassicals. They were more interested in fancy and so on, but which of course was very, very controlled and so on. But when we talk about the imagination that we see in the Romantics, the best description of that can be found in the book called The Romantic Imagination by Sir Maurice Bowra. The title says it all, The Romantic Imagination. And this is what he says, quoting William Blake: "This world of imagination is the world of eternity. It is the divine bosom into which we shall go after the death of the vegetated body. This world of imagination is infinite and temporal. This world of imagination is infinite and eternal, whereas the world of generation or vegetation, that is this physical existence, is finite and temporal. There exist in that eternal world the permanent realities of everything that we see reflected in this vegetable glass of nature. All things are comprehended in their eternal forms in the divine body of the Savior, the true wine of eternity, the human imagination." Now, for Blake, the imagination is nothing less than God. That's quite obvious, I think. This is not a normal imagination. This goes way beyond. And this is an experience that many people had experienced. Rousseau had. Before he wrote all that I read out to you, he had gone through a kind of a vision in which he says that myriads of shining thoughts just zoom through my mind. And that is what created his philosophy later on. Wordsworth went through the same thing. William Blake went through the same thing as a small boy, and so on. Now, this imagination is something different from what we normally think of. And it is metaphysical. I might call it transcendental. And it comes very close to the verge of religious experience. Now, here I have to mention one thing. Recent scholarship has concentrated on what we call religion and our religious experiences. What does it mean? Of course, there are some scholars like Richard Dawkins and others who would say that I am a religious person simply because I'm genetically wired to be that way. So that is one view. But scholars have started studying mental attitudes and particularly the physiology of people who have intense religious experiences. For instance, scans have been made on people as they've gone through a prayer, right? And one of the things that was found was this: in the medulla oblongata of the human brain, there is a part which is colored differently. With that is the part that deals with self-preservation primarily. So all your selfish thoughts, all your thoughts of yourself, primarily your ego, is focused on that part of your medulla oblongata. Now, when a person goes through a religious experience, scientifically and medically, it's been proved that somehow that the ego aspect of it becomes reduced. The coloration becomes reduced. Now, that was the kind of experience that Wordsworth was talking about, where he literally annihilated his ego. Now, this is an aspect that we will have to discuss in just a few seconds. So, imagination. Now, what does this mean? Let's go back to that much used and abused definition of poetry by William Wordsworth. You know it. Spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. Now, the experience is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, where he literally loses himself in that physical experience of his encounter with not just nature, sometimes in rural life, sometimes in urban life as well. Now, this is one thing that I wish somebody studied, because Dr. Nirmal Selvarmani makes this very clear in his essay. William Wordsworth is considered to be a nature poet, but then he did write quite a bit about rural life of human beings. And he also wrote quite a bit on urban life itself and of human beings. So this is an aspect that I don't think has come through much scholarship. So I wish somebody took that up. But the first part of it is this, where he is saturated with, he's diffused literally with that experience of nature, so that he literally loses himself. This is very similar to what, I know this sounds a little contradictory, but it's very close to the objectification theory that T.S. Eliot was talking about. And please remember this intensity of experience that I am talking about, not in the face of nature, but in spiritual experience, was something that T.S. Eliot did go through. And that was a point when dissociation of sensibilities and all that vanished into thin air. And that was when he wrote those intense but very difficult poems to read called the Four Quartets. They are difficult to read because they're so intense and because they're so personal. All right, so having said that, this aspect is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And when they are recollected in tranquility, what comes into play is the imagination. And Nirmal Selvarmani argues actually in his lecture that for William Wordsworth, his language itself, his poetic language itself, comes from nature. And he argues that the Lockean concept of tabula rasa was something that probably William Wordsworth imbibed, where where the human mind is literally a blank slate, where till nature forms her impressions on us. And from then on, to describe those impressions, you get language. And that is going back to Jacques Lacan. But having said that, this is the way poetry worked for him. It was the intense experience of nature, the experience of nature translated into the expression using imagination. This was the way it worked. And for him, imagination was literally divine, in the sense that when an artist, when a poet is able to imagine, he is literally becoming a demigod. This was what was called secondary creation. The primary creation, of course, is the creation of God. And this is secondary creation. And this is a concept that would be used later on by J.R.R. Tolkien in his writings when he called it subcreation. And this is a concept which goes back to the Romantics. Now, having said that, let's try to quickly look at some of the other key aspects in his dealing with nature. Now, please get this very clear. Nirmal Selvamani makes this very clear in his essay. Now, what is this nature that he's talking about? Is it the daffodils? What is he talking about? Now, one important thing is this. Some critics have called it depersonalization of nature, meaning when he talks about nature, when he talks, for instance, about a lake, he is not talking about a lake in the physical sense. And when he experiences that lake, he goes beyond that physical experience of the daffodils or the lake or the song of the solitary reaper, whatever it may be. He goes beyond that experience. And that physical entity before him vanishes, creating an idealized entity. So the daffodil really is not a daffodil. It is an idealization in a way, as Nirmal Selvamani says, in the Platonic sense. So that is a possibility. But it is not really the forces of nature per se that he's talking about. What happens there is that his creation, his imagination takes him beyond the world as we know it, as we experience it, into a different sphere completely. And there he becomes a prophet. Now, the idea of the prophet, the other expression for the word prophet is seer, right? And the word seer is what in Tamil, for instance, you call in the Tolkappiyam and in the old Tamil literature, they were very respected people. And remember, we are not talking about a caste system. This is pre-caste. These people were called Parpan, all right, literally translated seer, right? And a seer is a person who has an insight. And this is what Maurice Borra talks about. The imagination, as we see it in Wordsworth, is a kind of insight which takes him beyond the experience, the physical experience that he has, into a transcendental experience where he is able to see, as Blake talked about, the eternal. It is not a tree that he sees. He sees the eternal tree. The eternal tree, in a sense, as Nirmal says, the Platonic tree in the world of ideas. So this is what happens, which leads to another thing. Now, again, I wish you went home and did this little exercise. Go back home tonight and try to read Tintin Abbey lines. All right? Read Tintin Abbey lines. Many of you have already studied that in college, but read Tintin Abbey lines and try to find out where he talks about the Abbey. Where does he talk about the Abbey in Tintin Abbey lines? Actually, he doesn't. He never refers to the Abbey. The poem's called Tintin Abbey. But the point is that he's gone beyond that Abbey, that physical structure, and he's gone into a world which is The only way I can, the only way I can express that is the metaphysical. He's gone beyond. Now, that is so what some critics have said is this, that William Wordsworth strips nature of historicity. He strips nature of biography, of himself being there. Like I told you, it's the shedding of the ego. So he strips it of biography, and he strips it also of sociology. This is what a number of critics have argued. Now, that's another aspect of William Wordsworth. One or two more things that we have to talk about. One of the main characteristics of Romantic poetry, which is different from the old tradition of the bards that I was talking about. Now, bardic tradition primarily is a communal tradition. So Homer never sang his songs. By the way, please, as I repeat again and again to my students, Homer did not write Iliad or Odyssey. Iliad and Odyssey were written about 300 years after Homer's death. He was working purely in the oral tradition. But when Homer sang his songs, he sang his songs to a community of people sitting there for whom that song had a communal meaning and a sense. Now, the same thing can be found to a certain degree in the neoclassicals. Now, when you talk about Dryden, Pope, and so on, they are dealing with issues which are common to everybody, which are known to everybody, but which are expressed beautifully. That is what that world is all about. Now, Wordsworth is primarily a poet who talks about self-impressions. It is subjective. That's the best word. It is subjective poetry, and it is subjective in the sense that it is an expression of something that he personally experienced. Right now, the closest parallel, though she doesn't fit into this into this framework at all, the closest parallel that I can find to this kind of a phenomenon is Emily Dickinson. You know, every time I love reading Emily Dickinson, and the reason for that is this: every time I read Emily Dickinson, I get a different meaning completely, a different understanding of it, probably depending on the mood that I'm in. And I experience the same thing when I look at beautiful painting or when I listen to lovely classical music. Every time I listen to it, it's different. That's what makes art to me. But every time I read Emily Dickinson, I have this feeling when I come to the end of the poem. Take a poem like I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Right now, when I finish the poem, I have this feeling like Emily Dickinson's looking at me and saying, hey, come on, man, I cannot explain it to you, all right? You are not going to understand it. Whatever I say, whatever kind of words I may use, imagery I may use, you are never going to experience. No way, it's mine. Right? So that is the kind of thing that Wordsworth was talking about. He is a very, very personal poet. And that is true of the Romantic age as well, as M.H. Abrams discusses it. All right, so that's one thing. But then if you are a subjective artist, you are looking for truth. So what is the truth that he is looking for? Now, one thing is very clear. He's not looking for religious truth. He is not looking for religious truth in the sense that Locke was looking for instance, the philosopher Locke. And Locke was in many ways a Christian. He was a Christian. So for him, truth meant religious truth, right? Or he was very close to Locke. You get Isaac Newton. Now, for Isaac Newton, truth was the empirical factors which govern this universe. That was truth according to Isaac Newton. And then, of course, those truths reflect for Newton, those truths reflect the God who made it, right? Which is very closely Lockean. But these were not the truths that he was looking for. Now, if anybody is going to argue that the Romantic age and Wordsworth were against science, this was one point where he contradicted science. Science talks about objective truth, truth which can be examined out there and expressed in equations. This is what science does. Whereas for Wordsworth, truth is subjective. It is something that can be imbibed from nature, which goes beyond boundaries and which extends by imagination into a metaphysical world of his own. One interesting thing that you could study would be, anybody could study or do research on, would be what really was the philosophy of William Wordsworth. Because M.H. Abrams and a whole lot of others are debating that today. What was he, a pantheist? Because when I was a student, I was taught that he was a pantheist. All right. Now, was he? Maybe. You remember that good old story of the Buddha and his disciples waiting for him, and the Buddha turned up and he sat down and he just held up a flower in his hand. He never said a word. He just held up a flower in his hand, and one of his disciples from the audience smiled and nodded, and the Buddha smiled back at him. Okay, because that was the only person in that group of disciples who had understood. And this story is quoted by Joseph Campbell. And he says, what was that flower? It is just the experience of the flower. You don't go around asking for the meaning of a flower. Okay, so that was the subjectivity of his experience. So having said that, let's quickly conclude this. I think I have about half an hour more for a Q&A. Let me conclude this. Now, we are living today in disastrous times. You know that. What our friend here called a pandemic. Now, it is a pandemic, yes, but then I look at the other implications, the economic implications, the professional implications. I have never sat and lectured to a laptop before, but that is what I'm experiencing now. Where are those lovely personal students who sat there smiling at me? Where are they? Professionally, I'm going through trauma. Not just the trauma that people go through when they lose their jobs. And there are intense individual traumas that people are going through. And I experience that. I get text messages from students writing about what they're going through right now. It's intense. We are living in difficult times. And while Wordsworth's solution may not be the solution to our situation as of now, we can at least find solace. It is not a solution, certainly not. I do not propose Wordsworth as a solution to our problems. I'm not taking the line of Matthew Arnold when he said that the salvation of the human race would be poetry. I'm not taking the stance of Friedrich Nietzsche when he said that the salvation of the world is tragedy. I'm not taking that stance, but there is a possibility that we could at least find solace. I've very often said this. Why do I love literature? One of the reasons is this. For me, literature is like dope. It's like it is like taking a hallucinatory trip. And some of the best people to take you on a hallucinatory trip are the romantics. Particularly Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Read his Christabel. Read Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, that could form a solace, at least, for our present condition. So I hope this gives you some kind of an idea of my understanding of William Wordsworth. There is one other statement that I have to make here, and that is this. This is a statement which is made by Dr. Nirmal Selvamunni. Now, William Wordsworth is not only a subjective, personal poet. He is also non-community. You will never find him talking about communities in the sense that William Blake, for instance, does. So, and that is reflected in his characters. You get the old man, the leech gatherer. You get Lucy Gray. You get Ruth. You get so many others, but they're all individual. And one of my favorites, the last of the flock, the farmer who loves his lamb, and now he is bankrupt. He has to sell that lamb. And William Wordsworth talks about this mature, strong-willed, strong man standing in the street and sobbing, holding on to that lamb that he has to sell. Now, he talks about individual characters. He does not talk about communities, and he does not appeal to community. So he appeals to us as individuals. He has been called the people's poet, the human to human poet. And that is what William Wordsworth really is. And I thank you for this occasion that you gave me to talk about William Wordsworth. And I hope I have met at least some of your expectations. Thank you very much. Can we go into Q&A now, please?
Thank you so much, sir. That was such a splendid session. And you may say that literature was dope, but I think this session was dope, and you have certainly taken us on a hallucinatory trip towards the romantic age. That's wonderful. And your take on the observations of the medulla oblongata when we go through a religious experience was simply awesome. And as I was looking through all the participants, they were so steadily and with so much concentration, they were taking notes. And I think this is their time to ask their questions. And participants from Zoom, I ask you to raise your hands so that you may ask your questions directly to Professor Daniel David, sir, now. So I ask Meher Gandhi to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to our speaker.
Yes, sir. First of all, sir, thank you very much. It was extremely enlightening, and I am an undergraduate student, extremely passionate about literature. Sir, my question to you is regarding the statement that you made while experiencing the texts of Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
You said that you feel like the author herself is in a way taunting and saying that, you know, you wouldn't understand what she's trying to say no matter how much you try to.
Yeah.
So my question is it really important for us to understand what the author is trying to say? Or is it important for us to understand whatever the text is with taking into perspective whatever our subjective belief system is, whatever our subjective experiences have been like? So is it important for us to, you know, stick to what the author is saying, or to really understand what we feel like when we are reading or experiencing a text?
Good question. Very good question.
Thanks.
And the answer to that is something like this. I don't know whether this is going to, I know this is going to make most of us English teachers feel very, very inadequate. But I have said this often in class. You know, literature is something that I should not teach. Literature is something that I should not teach. I can teach physics. I can teach zoology, but literature is something that I should not teach for the very simple reason that the transaction of what you might call impulses here is from heart to heart rather than from brain to brain. So literature has to be experienced rather than understood. And that is the reason why we talk about the death of the author. Is there a text in the class? Because it is not right. It is not right for any of us to say, this is the meaning of the text. Go back to the story of Buddha. A text does not have a meaning per se. It just, a text is an experience. A poem particularly is an experience, and you were absolutely right. It depends on your, like I said, it depends on the mood that I'm in. It depends on what has been going on around me. It depends on my experience. It even depends on my gender. A whole lot of things go into play when you try to understand a text. It is rather, I shouldn't even say understand. It's when you try to experience the text. It's a matter of experience, I think, rather than understanding. But my problem with Emily Dickinson is this. there are two people that I find very difficult this way. One is Sylvia Plath, and the other is Emily Dickinson. I somehow feel that they have a kind of a grid around themselves into which I am just not able to break to experience really what the person is going through. And that is what I meant. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And also, sir,
Yeah.
no matter how much I listen to lectures and read, I still think myself to be a beginner. So I just want to ask from a beginner perspective, is there any book that would be the best for me to dive into, not just Wordsworth, but also the Romantic era, also the Romantic criticism? So is there an amalgamation of the both?
No, the best books that I would refer you to, particularly the individual poets, would be the Romantic Imagination.
Okay.
A.C. Bradley is a little outdated, but the Romantic Imagination by Sir Maurice Borra is very good. But if you want a better text than that, it would be Natural Supernaturalism by M.H. Abrams.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, yeah.
So thank you, Meher Gandhi. We are always finding ourselves at a junction where we cannot allow every participant to ask their questions, and this is something that we ourselves don't feel happy about. But one of the viewers from YouTube, Dr. Gunjan Saxena, would like to ask a question. The question is, does Wordsworth's poetic imagination resemble Vedic philosophy?
Well, I'm not very well used. I do not know Vedic philosophy too well, so I'm not really qualified to answer that question. But then the other aspect of that question, I think, makes sense, because if you're going to ask ourselves what really is Wordsworth's philosophy, point number one. Two, what really is Wordsworth's, what I might say, religious affiliation. That may be a very wrong expression, but still. Now, there are a whole lot of theories that are coming up right now. M.H. Abrams seriously questions his concept of pantheism. Okay, he says that actually you can't really call him a pantheist. There are other poets, of course, who you may call theists. For instance, when you talk about William Blake, you can talk about him as a theist. But when it comes to William Wordsworth, what really is his philosophy is a question. Okay, so his imagination could take the Vedic stance if it's going to go by pantheism. I'm not very sure. And I do not know Vedic philosophy well enough, so I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I'm sorry.
Well said, sir. So I think we have time, just about time, for only one participant from Zoom to answer their question. And I would like to ask Mr. Sayan Chatobade to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to sir.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Shayan.
Yeah.
I'm presently a PG student, English literature.
Okay.
My question was depended on what you said regarding the romantic imagination.
Yeah.
So I've been reading this book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Okay.
So there I came over this term called Übermensch.
Yes.
Which is basically a better version who is closest to God, and it's just the hyped version of a man. So I just like to clarify one thing, that is that something which is like Frederick is saying that is a romantic imagination by itself, or is it just the state of sublimity that none achieved unless Zarathustra spoke about it?
Okay. Now, first of all, Friedrich Nietzsche's stance there of the Übermensch is an existential stance. Okay, so the point is, it doesn't come anywhere near God. God doesn't exist there. All right, so we are talking there, when you talk about Zarathustra, and when you talk about the Übermensch, what he is talking about is a person who has risen to such a point of intellectual capability that he is beyond the moral and the immoral. There's nothing called moral for him. There's nothing called immoral for him. There's nothing right. There's nothing wrong. So that's a kind of I don't know. It's an ethical stance as well as a moralistic stance as well as a philosophical stance, where you've risen beyond all this. You see, if you're going to seriously ask yourself, and this is a very serious question which we could discuss for hours and hours, but if you're going to ask yourself, where do we get our sense of morality from? Okay. Right. Now there are two or three possible answers. All right. Now, one, like I told you earlier, some people will tell you that it's built into your genetic system. It's wired into your DNA. That's one argument. Another argument is that it's imposed on you by society. That is debatable in itself. And the third is that there is a divine being, a divine moral being who created you and who gave you a sense of morality. And top thinkers, very important thinkers like Habermas and a whole lot of Habermas is an atheist, but in spite of that, even he argues this. Now, what Nietzsche is trying to say in Zarathustra is you rise to a point where you are beyond all that. So in a sense, you're above God. You're not near God.
Right.
Okay, you're above God because God is a moral being. You're beyond all that. Okay, that is what he meant by the Übermensch or Overman, as it is called. Okay, that has nothing to do with imagination. It's an existence statement.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for such a wonderful and intellectual session. And I would like to offer the chair back to you so that you could give a closing and you could just bring the session to an end. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Now, first of all, I want to thank Kamaraj College and Professor Shasikala for asking me to do this, for the simple reason that you drove me back to Wordsworth. I have not studied, I have not read Wordsworth. I don't teach Wordsworth in class. So since I was a student, I don't think I've read anything at all about Wordsworth except when I did a little bit of reading for articles to be written in eco-criticism. Other than that, I've not read Wordsworth at all. You sent me back to Wordsworth, point number one, and you sent me on a very, very fruitful mission, because I've enjoyed reading Wordsworth now in my current position and time. And I have really, really enjoyed reading the lyrical ballads and the prelude and so on. I really enjoyed it. I thank you for forcing this on me. Right. So that is to the organizers of this webinar. The second thing that I would like to say is this. Please, I don't know, I hope my talk has raised questions. I hope it has raised doubts. I hope it has raised issues that are not resolved in what I said. I hope it has raised controversies. Now, if it has done that, please go and work on it. This is my final word. Please go and work on it. And please don't ever listen when someone tells you that a subject is overworked. Now, if you say you're going to do a PhD on William Wordsworth or on D.H. Lawrence or on Ernest Hemingway, people come around and tell you there are hundreds of theses and dissertations on Wordsworth or on D.H. Lawrence. Now, please don't listen to that, because if you're going to do that, you are limiting them. You're not limiting yourself, you're limiting them. You are trying to say that everything that could be said about Wordsworth has been said, and which is not true. Which is not true. We have just begun to understand William Wordsworth. So my suggestion to you would be this: please go ahead, read more and do more research. And I hope if a few of you could take this up and work on the Romantic poets as well as on William Wordsworth in papers or in presentations or in dissertations, then I would have done my job. And that would give me satisfaction. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience. I've not been able to see any of you, but thank you very much for being a wonderful audience. I hope this presentation was useful to you. Thank you very much, and thank you again to the organizers. Thank you.
That was a great piece of advice to all our aspiring scholars and faculty members, sir. And I, on behalf of the Department of English, Kamaraj College, Thoothukudi, would like to thank you for such a great and wonderful session.
Thank you.
And now it is time for the interview session, Iyal, which will be organized by Dr. P. Shasikala, Department of English, Kamaraj College, Thoothukudi. And before we could go to that, I would like to ask Mrs. S. Shakila, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to give us a felicitation for Professor Mark Sandy. Over to you, ma'am.
Good evening to all. It is a very rewarding occasion for us that we have Professor Mark Sandy amidst today. His research interests are in Romanticism, especially the poetry and poetics of the period. He completed a monograph on phonetics of self and forms in Keats and Shelley, and a second book length study of Romanticism, memory, and mourning. He planned to
Wishes to all the aspiring individuals who have gathered here today. The time is upon us to invite the chief guest, Dr. Mark Sandy, Professor of English Studies at Durham University from Durham, United Kingdom. He is an introspective scholar who has dedicated himself to study many aspects of the Romantic period. Professor Sandy is quite known as a published author who has written many works of critique and analysis with regard to the age of Wordsworth. He has also to his credit many valuable research articles, book chapters, and has also edited many books. The realm of the supernatural found in the concepts of haunting and ghosts are elaborately explained in many of Professor Sandy's works. It is through chanced events like these that we are elevated to learn intricate and amazing details of certain ages in literature. Now, it is time for the interview session, Iyal, to begin. Wishes to all the aspiring.
And now over to Dr. P. Shasikala to start Iyal, where we interview authors. Hope you have a good time. Thank you.
A very good evening to one and all gathered here. It gives me immense pleasure to have you all here for the next webinar. And this webinar focuses on William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was the central figure in the English Romantic Revolution in poetry. He formulated in his poems and his essays a new attitude towards nature. This amounted to a fresh view of the organic relation between man and the natural world, and it culminated in metaphors of a wedding between nature and the human mind. There is something about Wordsworth's poetry that stirs up our inner world, swirls through the heart of our thoughts and self, and settles everything back down in its rightful place, refreshed and restored. Is this not enough for us to celebrate him on his 250th birth anniversary? Born on 7th April 1770. But why celebrate now on 1st August? That would be the question in all your minds. There are two reasons. The first one is, as you all know, the fear of the consequences of the pandemic was at its peak then in April. And the second reason is the webinars. Though they have taken birth in April, they took time to evolve and attain a perfect shape. And that is the reason why we celebrate Wordsworth now in August. Late is better than never. So let's honor the great poet by embracing him through this webinar. Today, we have with us the most appropriate person to honor and celebrate Wordsworth. He is Professor Mark Sandy from Durham University, United Kingdom. What makes him the appropriate person is his research interests in Romanticism, especially the poetry and poetics of the period. His research has gone a long way and has explored Romanticism in almost all its dimensions. We are proud and honored to have him amidst us today. A very welcome, sir. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm sure it's more than I deserve.
Sir, we made you wait for a few minutes.
It's okay.
We apologize for that. And
No
it's
problem.
really nice that we have a person, an encyclopedia like you with us here for the interview. Shall we start with the question, sir?
Why not?
Yeah. Many people who suffer mental illness, including writers and artists, turn to drugs to self-medicate, but some artists make them intentionally to boost their creativity and the performance of the art. What was the effect of substance, drugs like opium, on poets of Romantic age? Can we link it to a psychological trait artists shared? Was Wordsworth affected by the same?
Well, the short answer would be no, but that's not very interesting. So I'll say a little bit more. I think it's often a conception that Romantic poets, Wordsworth, of course, partly through Coleridge, were avid takers of drugs, particularly in the form of opium. But in Wordsworth's case, that was not so. Wordsworth did not take opium in that way. And in fact, I think something we need to really understand is that opium was used for medicinal purposes during the Romantic age. And it was often taken in the form, in fact, of something called laudanum. And laudanum was a mixture of opium, spices, and red wine very often. And Coleridge, of course, who becomes addicted to opium in his later life, started taking opium in the form of laudanum for rheumatism. So he took it initially medicinally, and then later, because opium is so addictive, became addicted to opium. I think whether it's a trait of all writers or artists, I'm not sure I can answer that. It is clear that some writers do think that the taking of substances, be it opium or other drugs, gives them some heightened sense of consciousness or a new insight or a different way of looking at the world. It's interesting, I suppose, that some of the legatees of Romanticism, think about the Beat Generation writers in the United States, for example, people like Allen Ginsberg, a great advocate and admirer of Blake, for instance, or people like William Burroughs, for example, author of Naked Lunch, clearly experimented, as did Aldous Huxley, of course, in his Doors of Perception, a phrase taken from William Blake, clearly experimented with drugs as a means to aid their creativity. But I think just two things to bear in mind. One, opium, of course, was an illicit trade. It was used as a recreational drug, but it was also used as a medicine, and that's what led to Coleridge's addiction. And in the case of Wordsworth, as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence to suggest that Wordsworth himself ever took opium or other substances to heighten his creativity.
That's indeed true. Some take it for recreation and then get addicted to it in the later period of time with the continuous usage of it. Moving on to the next question. Hellenism, as it is defined, is devotion to ancient Greek thought, customs, or styles. With regard to poems of Shelley, Keats, and others who employed Greek myths into their poetry, can we take this Hellenistic? And if it is, where do you think this influence came from?
I mean, and one way of defining the word romantic, I suppose, is to think about, to break it down really into its constituent parts and to think about it as antic or focused on or obsessed with things Roman and things Greco-Roman for that matter too. So I think the influence of Greek and Roman culture, the ruins of its civilization, its aesthetic aspirations, its culture and philosophy would have been well known to all of the Romantic poets. We can see hints, for example, of Wordsworth's fascination with aspects of Platonism, and you could certainly think of perhaps one of his famous odes, as the ode Intimations on Immortality, as being a Neoplatonic poem. So, and I think it's much to do also with the kind of education that, for instance, Coleridge and Wordsworth would have had, where they would have been acquainted with the classical authors, both from Greek and Roman civilization. There's also a good deal of interest, I suppose, in the late 18th century, moving into the 19th, in ruins, for example. I mean, you can see Edmund Burke writing about the effect of ruins as something that initiates or leads to a sublime experience. And ruins, yes, of Greco-Roman civilization, but equally there was interest in Egyptian artifacts and ruins. I mean, you can think, for instance, of later Romantic poets like Shelley, for example, writing Ozymandias, which is a sonnet essentially about the figurehead of Ramesses II, so from Egyptian culture. Keats is making reference to Egyptian culture too, and the Sphinx, for example, in his Hyperion poem. So, I mean, I think Hellenism is certainly there in the first generation Romantic poets' work. I think it probably really comes to a head, though, in the second generation. I think probably Keats, Shelley, Barnes. You can think of Barnes writing Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, for example, where one canto is dedicated, of course, to his poetic voyage of Greece and the Greek islands and the ruins of that civilization, and then Canto 4 dwells on the ruins of Rome and the Colosseum, but also, of course, of Venice and the Venetian Republic. So, kind of Italian, the legacy of Rome culture in Italian history and art there. And of course, I mean, we mustn't forget that, for instance, someone like Shelley, Shelley could read Greek, and he translated the Symposium, parts of the Symposium and parts of Ion too, Plato's great works. So it's something that's, I think, partly in the ether. There's a lot of archaeological interest in ruins and civilization. There's a lot of interest in the aesthetics and aspirations of Greek and Roman art. And also interest in the philosophy, and I think it really culminates in the second generation Romantic writers. And you can see it in Shelley's poems like Apis-Psychidion, for example, Keats's Hyperion poems, Barnes' majestic epic tour of Europe, and Europe both present but also the Europe that once was, and the Greece and Rome of the past.
So we have made it clear that during the Romantic age, England became increasingly enamored of Greeks and Romans, and the Romantic poets turned to the past and to the East for inspiration. The next question is, the French Revolution played a huge role in influencing Romantic writers. Apart from the French Revolution and other instigators told by many theorists and literary historians, what are some other important things that made the age as it is?
Well, I think if we're thinking about historical events, I mean, I might just pause for a moment to reflect on the French Revolution, and particularly in the context of Wordsworth. Let us not forget that Wordsworth, of course, was in France at the time of the French Revolution, and he writes those famous lines in the prelude about the event itself. Bliss, was it alive? Was it to be alive in that dawn? So he, like many of his fellow contemporaries, at least on the radical side of the political question, thought of the French Revolution as a positive. I mean, this was the great champion of brotherhood, of equality, and of liberty. I think we must also remember, of course, that Wordsworth saw the other side of the French Revolution. I mean, he saw the reign of tyranny that took place with Robespierre coming to power. He saw the September massacres, and he saw, if you like, these rather utopian, ideal political aspirations crash and burn in many senses. So I think that was something that affected him and his fellow poets deeply. And I think it had ramifications, particularly in Britain, in other key historical events that then took place subsequently in the 19th century. I mean, as you will know, I mean, at the time, as in the turn of the century, there are many rapid changes occurring. I mean, there was the hint of hope with the possibility of political revolution in France that turned into tyranny, but that had spurred people in Britain to think about widening the franchise, wanting political reform, wanting more people to have the vote. And there was pressure from the masses for political reform. It's political reform in Britain that took a long time to come. I mean, it doesn't really take place, and then only in a partial way by 1832 with the Great Reform Bill. But I think the ghost, if you like, the spectre of the French Revolution haunted the government and the authorities of the day, because they were terribly worried that this fervour, this pressure for political change and reform, partly also spurred on by poor harvests, Britain's involvement subsequently in the Napoleonic War, that there was a danger that this pressure for political reform might turn into an actual physical revolution, and one that might end in the same kind of bloody means that the French Revolution came to. So I think the shadow, if you like, of the French Revolution spans across these various social, political concerns in Britain and the government's responses to them, which effectively was to be perhaps quite draconian, to squash as much as possible people's right to protest and advocate the cause of political reform. You'll remember, for instance, they brought in the very repressive 6 Acts that prevented radical presses, for instance, from publishing works and manifestos that would have spoken to the cause of political reform.
The readers of literature would have known that the French Revolution had a major influence, but you have enumerated so many factors now. It's really nice to listen to you, sir. And the graveyard poets you mentioned in particular, poets like Keats and James Macpherson, and the transitional poets like Cowper, Gray, and Goldsmith are often recognized as precursors of the Romantic movement. When we talk about the predecessors of Wordsworth, who do you think inspired Wordsworth the most?
Well, I mean, I think Wordsworth was open to many influences. I mean, I think the graveyard poets are an interesting group to consider in relation to Wordsworth, because writers, as you mentioned, Thomas Gray, for example, Thomas Parnell, Goldsmith, Cowper, Thomason, of course, writing the Seasons. I mean, it marks a kind of turn in the late 18th century away from simply loco-descriptive poetry of local scenes and environments to something that is dealing with the subject, with the self. Perhaps another very good example of that, someone that we did mention, is Thomas Young and his long poem Night Thoughts, which is clearly a meditative kind of poem. It has a kind of introspection to it, and I think that is something that clearly is influencing Wordsworth's writing, particularly of the Prelude, with this account of the growth of the poet's mind, but also the lyrical balance too. This emphasis, I think, on the individual and the individual's human being and their thoughts being a subject worthy of poetry, and that turn starts, I think, with the graveyard poets. I think there are other influences too of coming out of the 18th century on Wordsworth's poetry. For instance, I think Charlotte Smith's a sequence of sonnets that she writes and revises over a number of years, the elegiac sonnets. I think that kind of turned to questions of loss and consolation and grief, certainly influence Wordsworth. And I think also the dramatist Joanna Baillie, obviously not of the Graveyard Poet set, but I think she's a very important influence on Wordsworth. She writes in 3 volumes plays on the passions, and she's very interested in passion and feeling and dramatizing the extremity of feeling. And I think that's something that we can see, coming through in Wordsworth's interest, focus on the kind of spontaneous overflow of feelings, as it were. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of influences here. I mean, there are others beyond the 18th century. Milton, of course, would be another key 17th century influence on Wordsworth, and particularly on the Prelude, where at last Wordsworth has come to write an epic poem about the growth of a single individual's mind. And he's taking his cue from Milton, and the very first book of the Prelude picks up with Wordsworth choosing his theme and his path through the world. And that's exactly how Paradise Lost, Milton's epic, ends, with Adam and Eve now banished from the garden and looking forth to choose their path, their way in the world. So I hope that goes some way to giving you a taste of the various influences exerted on Wordsworth.
So it's the amalgamation of so many influences that has got us Wordsworth, actually. A great man indeed. And in English literature, the key figures of the Romantic movement are considered to be a group of poets, including Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Byron, Shelley, and Blake. Apart from Wordsworth, who would you consider as the greatest poet of the age, and what's the reason behind?
Well, I find that a very difficult question to answer, I think. Of course, I'm a great admirer of Wordsworth. And I think for me, I'm probably rather torn between Keats and Shelley at that point. I think possibly Keats. I mean, I think Keats is a remarkable poet of the period. I suppose in many respects, you might think of him as the kind of archetypal romantic poet figure. He lives a rather short, arguably tragic life, a life that is full of trials and tribulations and sufferings on a personal, economic level. But I think what's really remarkable about Keats, given his short poetic career, bearing in mind he's born in 1795, he dies in 1821, so before his 26th birthday. You look at the body of work that Keats left behind, and look at works like Endymion or Lines on a Mermaid Tavern, or I stood tiptoe on a hill, compared with the later works of, as it were, the odes, for example, to Nightingale, to Autumn. I mean, just to sort of see the kind of concentrated progress that Keats has made as a poet in that very short space of time, I think is quite remarkable. And I think To Autumn, if we take To Autumn to be the last of the odes that he writes, it is a wonderful condensation of some of the things I was talking about in relation to the influence of 18th century loco-descriptive poetry. It's a poem which seems to evoke the landscape in a descriptive manner, in a way that perhaps echoes aspects of Cowper and Thompson, but it's a poem which actually, if you like, makes nature a natural process, rather than being simply observed by the mind of the onlooker. It actually makes nature do its thinking for us. I mean, the wonderful line where he talks about the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, and the way that Keats transfers thought from the human observing subject to the bees themselves, that are busy with their clammy cells. So I think Keats was a truly remarkable poet. So if I'm not allowed to say Wordsworth, I would have to say Keats.
Yeah, true, sir. Though short-lived, Keats has contributed so much to literature. And Robert Southey was a romantic poet, like his friends William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The trio became known as the Lake Poets. Why were they labeled so? Was there any reason behind it?
Yeah, a couple of things to say about the term lake poets. It comes partly from the region of geography. Although Coleridge and Wordsworth spent some time in the West Country, in the southwest of the United Kingdom, in Devon, the county of Devon, they spent a good deal in fact, most of their creative lives, and indeed Wordsworth spent most of his life, having been born in Cockermouth, in areas that in Wordsworth's lifetime were known as Westmoreland and Cumberland, now more readily known to us as Cumbria, and is part of what we call the Lake District. So in that sense, it so happened at the sort of this period of time that Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey himself too were inhabitants of the Lake District of Westmoreland and Cumberland, and hence this kind of label for them of the Lake poets. It's a term that they wouldn't have used necessarily of themselves or about themselves. It's a term that Francis Jeffrey, one of the Tory conservative reviewers for Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, used, and he didn't mean it in a particularly favourable way. I mean, he meant the term Lake poets as a bit of a slight to suggest their unsophistication, as it were, their kind of rude poetic ways and views. I mean, he wasn't thinking of them particularly favourably, and it's a term I think that becomes consolidated if you look to the second generation romantic poet, someone like Lord Byron, when he writes his mock epic comedy Don Juan. In the dedication to that poem, he talks about the Lake poets. He lambasts Wordsworth and Coleridge. He talks about the way that Keats, for example, second generation romantic writer, is the tadpole of the Lakers. So again, he takes up this term Lake poets as a slight against them, really. So I think it's partly negative critical reviews in the form of Francis Jeffrey's reviews in Blackwood's, and partly to do with the geographic region that they occupied. And of course, I suppose we would want to say now that is also to do with the views about poetry and about nature that Coleridge and Wordsworth to an extent shared. Southey's a bit more complicated because although he was a writer living at the same time in the same geographical region, I'm not sure that Southey assented to all of the views about poetry, language and nature that Wordsworth and Coleridge did. Although it's worth remembering that Southey was part of the original ideal plan, utopian idea that they had of creating a kind of new society, pantocracy, this idea that they would go to Kentucky in America and start a new kind of community. It never happened. In fact, I think various personal and economic pressures prevented this plan from occurring, and they did think about going to Wales, another part of the UK, to initiate this ideal society, but again, for various reasons, personal and perhaps economic, this plan never came to fruition. Yeah, I hope that helps a little.
Yeah, definitely. We have always known them as lake poets, but we didn't know the reason behind. You have given us a wonderful explanation today. And COVID-19 is an ongoing global pandemic of coronavirus disease. In light of the current epidemic, what would have been the thought process of the nature poet if he were alive?
It's difficult to know exactly what Wordsworth's thoughts would have been. I'm not sure I can claim to read Wordsworth's mind. I think I could say something about how we might sort of start to couch a response as a reader to Wordsworth and the pandemic. Keats, of course, the poet that I've already mentioned, was a very astute reader of Wordsworth. And in that famous letter of Keats, where he talks about the Wordsworth as having an egotistical sublime, he also identifies something in Wordsworth's presentation of nature, which is that he feels that Wordsworth is always pressing up against these slightly darker, more insidious implications of nature. I mean, if you think, for example, of the boat stealing episode in the Prelude, where the younger Wordsworth is led to steal the shepherd's boat. He's led one summer evening by nature. He transgresses by stealing the boat, and then this huge promontory of rock rises up and chastises him for his theft. And he's haunted by the thought of this force of nature, this kind of awful force of nature, this nature that's no longer the gentle guiding force, but a kind of chastising, a kind of playing the role of a parent that is telling you off for having committed some kind of crime or misdemeanor. And I think that plays into how we might respond to nature in Wordsworth. I think he's very aware that nature is capable of darker machinations. I mean, he says elsewhere, doesn't he, that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. But what does nature do if the heart's not so sure or doesn't treat nature well? I mean, there are other instances, aren't there? That wonderful poem Nutting, for example, where Wordsworth describes again as a young boy how he goes and reads the nuts from the grove and then is chastised again by nature for this kind of transgression. So I think there's that sense that nature is capable, can be raw in tooth and claw, as it were. It's not always this ideal nursling, harmonious moral guardian. It can be something that is capable of acting, as it were, vengefully against humans. And perhaps, we could, I'm sure, from that construct kind of more eco-critical, sympathetic kind of reading, which perhaps we would see Wordsworth advocating the need to be respectful of nature and to treat her well and to adhere to her lessons, because in instances when we transgress against her, Wordsworth often finds that there are serious consequences, and we may well see that sense of whether he responds negatively or positively to nature and her response to him as a way of reading what Wordsworth would tell us about the pandemic. And perhaps there is an urgency there that we need to think about being more respectful of the natural world and our interactions with it.
That's true indeed, sir. The pairing of Wordsworth and Coleridge was particularly enduring and fruitful, even if it was ultimately ruinous. So intertwined were the two men's early lives that any biography of either one, in effect, becomes a dual biography. Sade has reflected upon the relationship as Coleridge being the very rain and air and sunshine of Wordsworth's intellect. Considering all such assumptions we have come across over the years, how can we define the relationship between Wordsworth and Coleridge?
Well, like all relationships, it's complicated. And which is to say that, I mean, I think one of the wonderful things about Southey's phrase, this idea that that Coleridge is being the very rain and air and sunshine for Wordsworth's mind or his intellect, I think is rather wonderful. I mean, it's a sense that if you like, Coleridge is providing the kinds of elementals, if you will, that Wordsworth is then able to conjure with. And I think it speaks to the fact that there is this kind of, and there was undoubtedly this kind of reciprocal relationship between Coleridge and Wordsworth. I mean, the lyrical ballads, first edition, and to a large extent the second edition, first edition 1798 and second edition 1800, and then a further edition in 1802, was a collaborative enterprise. I'm aware that there has been much ink spilt about this kind of falling out between Coleridge and Wordsworth, and particularly with the second edition of lyrical ballads. I mean, part of the supposed falling out that takes place is because Coleridge has been labouring on writing Christabel, that famous poem of his. And he goes one evening to read it to Dorothy and William, and he's very pleased with what he's achieved. And according to Dorothy's accounts, at least, Wordsworth seems very happy with it. She's very taken with the poem, and it sort of gets a positive response. But Wordsworth actually then chooses not to include Christabel, perhaps on the grounds that its subject matter is too supernatural, in the second edition of lyrical ballads, and favours his own poem, a very good poem that I'll say something else perhaps about it in a moment, Michael, which is inserted into that second edition. And people have made much of this as being the kind of great split between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And I think it is true that there was some level of disagreement between them. But we mustn't forget that, for instance, Coleridge wrote out in fair copy the first 100, 200 lines or so of Michael, the very poem that Wordsworth was going to include in the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, over Christabel. And we mustn't forget either that little later on, about 1811, 1812, Dorothy, Coleridge and Wordsworth go on a trip to Germany. So this sense that there was this huge rift that was irreconcilable over subsequent editions of Lyrical Ballads and Wordsworth, I think has been slightly overemphasized. It does seem to me that Southey is onto something here, because I think Coleridge and Wordsworth stayed in a kind of poetic, if you like, imaginative conversation, with dialogue with one another throughout their writing careers.
So we have just known that they have been good friends. We have shared some personal anecdotes now to get a better idea about their exact relationship. Thanks a lot, sir. And we all know the famous definition of Wordsworth, that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. We have read this definition from the time of our undergraduate dates or even prior. How do you elucidate this?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one way of responding to Wordsworth's claim is to think about, I suppose I mentioned Edmund Burke earlier on, and to think about ideas of the sublime. This is a very important idea to the Romantic period, that that nature, often nature, I mean, for Burke it could be ruins or darkness or beauty, can lead you to this kind of elevated transcendental state. I mean, of course, terror can also lead you to this state. I mean, awful, that word that I used before, means awesome in a kind of godlike, inspiring way. But that kind of awe can also come with terror, as well as pleasure and delight and beauty. And I think here what Wordsworth is hinting at is that in the moment of a kind of sublime experience, in the moment of imaginative revelation, you are overcome with feelings. You mental faculties, your intellect can't make sense of what you're experiencing. I mean, to put it simply, I suppose, if you thought to yourself in the moment of a sublime experience, I am having a sublime experience, it's not sublime. Clearly not, because you should be so overcome with the moment that you're in that you can't respond or make sense of it. And I think what Wordsworth then is going on to say is that it's only after the event, it's only after that sublime, awesome, awful moment has passed, that you can start to make sense of what's happened, that you recollect emotion in tranquility, that you make some sense of what has occurred, you put it into some kind of order, find some form of verbal expression for this very powerful, overwhelming feeling. So I would read it, I think, or at least one way of reading it is in terms of Romantic ideas about the sublime.
So the definition is aptly defined again by Mr. Mark here. And the academicians who thrive in analyzing and scrutinizing literature are drawn to Wordsworth. When and why did you decide to focus on the poet? Is there a particular instance that you would like to share as to when you fell in love with Wordsworth?
That's a difficult question to answer. I feel like Wordsworth has always been with me. I mean, I think I can't remember when I first read Wordsworth. I must confess. I suppose it must have been. No, it must have been before my undergraduate days, which are so long ago I can't remember those. But I think probably for me, I mentioned Keats already and Shelley in passing. I mean, I suppose as a romanticist, my first love are Keats and Shelley. And I think one of Keats, as I mentioned, is a careful reader of Wordsworth, but actually Shelley, perhaps even more so. Shelley is a very astute reader and respondent to Wordsworth. You will find in Shelley's poetry numerous allusions to, I mean, take for example the beginning of one of his early 1815 poems, Alastor, or The Spirit of Solitude. That opening preamble to the poem of the poet narrator clearly evokes imagery and language from Tintin Abbey and the Intimations Ode, and that runs all the way through Shelley's career. Even in his very last poem, The Triumph of Life, that there you can see references still to Tintin Abbey and the intimations owed. So, I mean, he's very, I mean, Shelley might be critical, he might be testing, if you like, the poetic fiction that Wordsworth offers us about the interaction between self and nature, but he's always deeply invested in Wordsworth, and he really knew his Wordsworth. And I think probably Shelley's admiration for him sent me back to really reread Wordsworth at a slightly later point in my career. I'm very glad that I did, because I think it was reading Wordsworth again that led me to write the second book on memory and mourning in romantic poetry, because it struck me that Wordsworth really was this very interesting poet of consolation, yes, but also disconsolation, of recognizing the limitations of comfort that nature can provide. I mean, you know, I suppose Wordsworth says, doesn't he, that there's strength in what remains behind. But the question is, what remains behind, and what do we make of it? And is it consoling or not?
So, to tell the fact, it is your admiration for Shelley, and in turn Shelley's admiration for Wordsworth that has made you fall in love with Wordsworth. That's really interesting, sir. Wordsworth is known for his famous and emphatic quotes like, fill your paper with the breathings of your heart, or the strongest minds are often those whom the noisy world hears least. After hearing such quotes, what do you consider as the best line penned by Wordsworth? What will you deem as the best poem handed by the great poet?
Well, that's a difficult one, I think. I suppose partly because of Wordsworth's reputation for his, and indeed, of course, he says it both in the original advertisement to Local Bellas, and also in the more extended preface to the 1802 edition, that he seems very interested, doesn't he, in writing the most kind of prosaic of poems, of making ordinary language of common man work in a poetical way. And of course, some of those negative reviewers, like Francis Jaffrey, of course, took him to task for doing so. The line that comes to mind, which you may not think is very impressive, but I will put it in context in just a moment, is that he never lifted up a single stone. That is one of the most remarkable lines I think that has ever been written. It comes at the end of the poem that I mentioned previously, of Wordsworth's Michael. It's a poem, if you don't know it, I'm sure some of you will, about a shepherd who has a son quite late in life, almost miraculously late in life, has a great bond between father and son, but for economic reasons has to send Luke, his son, away from him. They agree that they will stay at least spiritually connected by starting the work on a sheepfold, which becomes a kind of emblem of the covenant between them, and that Michael says to his son that we'll complete this when you return. In the event of the poem, sadly, Luke does not return. He falls into ignominy, as Wordsworth tells us, and Michael is left with this incomplete sheepfold. I'll just read you just a couple of lines, if I may, and this will put that line in context. This is Michael when he's feeling now somewhat bereft. After he realizes Luke is never coming back, he constantly returns to the sight of this incomplete sheepfold. 'Tis not forgotten yet, the pity which was then in every heart for the old man, and 'tis believed by all that many and many a day he thither went, and never lifted up a single stone. And there, by the sheepfold, sometimes was he seen, sitting alone with that his faithful dog, then old beside him laying at his feet, the length of full 7 years from time to time, he at the building of this sheepfold wrought, and left the work unfinished when he died. That one stone carries so much pathos. It is the single stone that speaks to the measurement of economy and mathematics that has ruined the family, that has led to this tragedy of Luke being sent away and falling into ignominy. It is also the fact that what Wordsworth is so interested in there is not the action of lifting the stone, but not lifting the stone. Wordsworth is a poet fascinated by things that are undone, actions not carried out, and by things that are unseen. That single stone speaks back to the very opening of the poem, where we're told by the poet narrator that not on the main highway, but just from it, there is a struggling heap of unhewn stones. And you need to know where to look for those stones, and you need to understand the story that's attached to those stones before you really understand the significance of what they represent. So it's wonderfully tragic and pathetic in the sense of pathos, and it turns the poem full circle. It brings the poem back to its own catastrophic start, where the tragedy has already occurred and the sheepfold has now, in its incomplete form, fallen into utter ruin. And it speaks to the forces, economic and industrial, that have changed the landscape that Michael lived for so many years, quite happily attuned to forever. So it is the loss of his son, it is the loss of a whole way of life. And it also speaks, I suppose, to Michael's, despite his doubts, perhaps his fears that his strength in love might be misplaced, his commitment to the possibility that that reciprocal relationship between himself and his son may still be intact, even if he starts to fear that it is hopeless.
That indeed should have been the best line for when you started reading the poem. We could feel you getting connected with Wordsworth himself, and that makes him really victorious as a poet. And every human being is prone to tragedy. This tragic feel often finds an outlet for a writer in his creative work. What was so tragic about Wordsworth that found voice in his poetry?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I caution. I mean, Wordsworth writes the Prelude, and he's writing about the growth of the poet's mind. So, in some ways, he's inviting us perhaps to read him, biographically. Perhaps that's inevitable. I'm always a little wary of reading people, kind of psychobiographically. The great Irish poet W.B. Yeats says, doesn't he, somewhere, I'm going to paraphrase him horribly, but he says more or less that the man that sits down to eat breakfast is not the same man that sits down to write poetry. So there's a distinction to be made there. That said, I mean, from a kind of biographical perspective, it is quite clear that Wordsworth had a fairly tragic life, I suppose. The famous episode, I'm sure, that will come to mind, and is clearly documented in the Prelude, of course, is the death of his father just after Christmas. He's still relatively young. He's returning, of course, from being away at school, and he's there barely a week back at home when he tells us that his father died. Now, John Wordsworth, his father, he collected rents from tenants for a landlord, but out in a rural community. And poor John, unfortunately, got caught in an unexpected storm out on Cold Fell, and contracted, I guess, something like pneumonia, and died as a consequence. So that's a fairly tragic episode in a young boy's life. It's made doubly tragic by the fact, of course, that Wordsworth had already lost his mother. So it left Wordsworth and his siblings, Dorothy included, orphans. I mean, they had extended family that were able to look after them, but it must have been a very tragic and disturbing moment. I mean, it certainly makes me think of the way that Wordsworth presents nature in this kind of parental form very often, taking the place of a kind of parent. Not so much a god, actually. I mean, at least in the earlier version of the Prelude, but a kind of parental figure, a more heterodox figure of a guardian that would look after him, educate him, keep him on the straight and narrow, and so on. And it's very much in terms that you might expect of a parent. So we could, of course, do some psychobiographical readings there, but we won't. I think other things that in later life for Wordsworth that affected him deeply, and that was the death of another John. He also had an elder brother called John Wordsworth, taking his name from his father. And John was a sea captain, and unfortunately lost his life and his ship. The ship was the Earl of Abergavenny in early February of 1805, and he went down with his ship. And I think that affected Wordsworth very deeply. Of course, he writes eventually a very moving poem. The poem Elegiac Stanzas on Beaumont's Peel Castle, in fact, is a poem as it dwells on the stormy seas depicted in that painting, is a poem that is coming to terms, or trying to come to terms with the death of his brother John. And of course, let us not forget, although Wordsworth had a number of children, one, of course, to Annette Vallon in France, when he was over in France. Two of his children also died in relative infancy in about 1811. So there was, sadly, I mean, a good deal of personal loss, tragedy, you might say, impinging on Wordsworth's life. I mean, he's very saddened too later on, of course, by the death of one of his daughters, Dora. She died, I think, in early middle age, but nonetheless was deeply affected by that. So, I mean, just a quick sort of purview of Wordsworth's biography suggests that he was well acquainted with personal loss and tragedy.
So the personal losses have kindled his emotions so much that his creative work has moved the hearts of so many who have read his work. Maybe that was the reason behind.
I think so. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that the loss of his father is the moment and the prelude, that is the reparation, the imaginative font to which he is always returning. He's always sort of revisiting that moment in a bid to find some kind of, I suppose, consolation, if consolation is possible. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Poetry is a special genre on its own, because the readers can come up with layers of meaning for a single line. What will be your interpretation of the line? The child is the father of the man. The child is father of the man.
Yeah, it's one of Wordsworth's interesting lines, isn't it? And in some ways, it perhaps speaks in part to the relationship that Wordsworth had with Dorothy. After all, of course, at the point of John Wordsworth, William's father's death, Dorothy and William were separated in terms of the respective extended families that they went to, and only were able to meet each other again in adolescence. So I think there's a part of the importance of Dorothy and Wordsworth always wanting, biographically at least, to try to recapture or recuperate something of that missed childhood that they would have otherwise had together. I think it probably speaks beyond sort of biographical, historical circumstance to Wordsworth, and he's not alone. There's other romantics were fascinated by the figure of the child. I mean, William Blake, of course, is in Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and the figure of the child has a different kind of perception of the world. It's a perception that doesn't succumb to rational categories and distinctions, to mathematical apportioning out of objects and counting of things. I mean, if you think about, for instance, a poem like We Are Seven, where the girl is interrogated by the kind of dissecting mind of the adult that subscribes to very clear-cut distinctions about what it means to be alive or dead, what it means to be absent or present, how many people are present, and she goes each day to the graveyard to play with her brothers and sisters, and the grown-up keeps asking her, "How many are you?" Because to the grown-up mind, she's only one, because her siblings are either absent or have sadly passed away. But her response is always to insist that we are seven. Her perception of what it means to be connected to her siblings and her perception of the world does not subscribe to these very carefully demarcated, rationalized distinctions. And I think that, so that the child and the child's perception is really a key formative emblem, I think, of the kind of relationship that we should have with nature and with the world, by being attuned to some deeper kind of spiritual, metaphysical, perhaps, understanding of the world. I mean, if you think about old intimations of immortality, for example, that's very much the kind of the story that unfolds there, is that the the older mind has, the fled is that visionary gleam, and yet the adult mind can remember some dim sense of the celestial light that he was once connected with. In his earlier days, if not before before being born, that there's this sense of much deeper connection. And as he grows up and falls into the world of habit and custom, he becomes entrapped by the prison house of language. So these experiences of habit, custom, limit the more fruitful and free perceptions of the child. So I think for Wordsworth, getting back to that sense of interconnection, bypassing, if you like, those very kind of rational categories, way of measuring the world, is deeply important. And I think that's what he means by it. I mean, in itself, the phrase kind of inverts theology, doesn't it? Because of course it's suggesting that the child, the earlier formative stage, is much more important than the product, this fructification, this mature father figure.
That's indeed a great explanation that you have given. Maybe Wordsworth meant to express hope that he would retain the joys of youth for childhood. It's a magical, a magnificent time of innocence, which helps them to be a part of the natural world. Maybe.
Yeah.
And the next question is, what was this distinct affinity that Wordsworth found with nature, that he found when to all emotions by seeing semblance for them in the river, the cloud, and the mountain?
It's an interesting question. I mean, and it's a combination of, it sort of speaks to me of the river, the cloud, and the mountain, I suppose, to what we might sort of see as a kind of I suppose a kind of holy trinity, but a kind of unorthodox holy trinity that Wordsworth often comes back to. I mean, in Tinton Abbey, he talks about the way, doesn't he, that you become alert to a kind of sublime presence that disturbs me, that of something far more deeply interfused, that is in the light of setting suns, or the round ocean, the blue sky, and the living air, and the mind of man, and these things kind of coalesce together, these elements, if you like, of light, air, water, and earth, and it's at that point, if you like, when those things are in conjunction with one another, that I think Wordsworth feels he achieves kind of revelation or insight into the spiritual nature, the transcendental, if you will, that the natural world is a kind of gateway to. So I think it's a very, very good question. And it's those elemental aspects. So if we think about it in terms of water, light, air, earth, that Shelley's very attuned to in his poetry when he's responding to Wordsworth. So yes, perceptive point.
So in a way, we could say that people who spend a lot of time with nature retain the purity and nobility of their souls.
Yes, so long as you obey what nature instructs you to do.
Yes, sir. Wordsworth's writing on nature was no wonder for the age, for it was not corrupted by technology. But in the present scenario, where people have looped themselves with technology and have lost connection with nature, who would you think has taken the same amount of inspiration from nature to create works of literature in this contemporary age?
Oh, there are many, and I obviously can't deal with all of them. I suppose if we think about British, say 20th century poets, for example, Ted Hughes would be one that comes to mind. I mean, Ted Hughes is deeply, always was invested, interested in the natural world, and then his later collections of poems. I mean, Hawk in the Rain being one of the earlier ones, which was 1957, isn't it? And then things like the 1991 collection Wolf Watching. I mean, he becomes much more overtly kind of ecological in his sort of poetic writing and outlook. But Hughes all the way through was very interested in, as you've just said, in fact, in this idea that we are kind of trapped within the cockpits of our own mind, as it were, he puts it, and we've lost touch we've lost connection with the outside world and the natural rhythms of things, and that we really, he puts it almost in kind of terms of sort of using a radio almost, that we need to retune ourselves, that we need to get our antennae attuned back to the natural world. So certainly Hughes would be one of them, and you can look at, you know, Hawk in the Rain, the poem that is also the title of that earlier collection, is a very good example of Hughes writing a poem from the perspective of the hawk itself. So a kind of really intersubjective kind of poem, a kind of poem in which he's kind of dissolving his poetic self into the kind of consciousness of this wonderful predatory bird, and he does that in other moments too, and in later collections. Seamus Heaney, I guess, the Irish poet, is deeply interested in nature and the natural world. You know, his famous poem Digging speaks, I think, to a kind of Wordsworthian connection, not just with nature, but also with that kind of sense of father-son relationship too. And there are others too, of course, across the other side of the Atlantic from Britain. I think poets like William Carlos Williams, Robert Frost, a great admirer of Wordsworth and his prosaic writing style. And I think someone like Wallace Stevens, actually. Wallace Stevens is deeply fascinated and often appalled by the Romantic. He often is wanting to banish it from his poetry, often invoking it, and then wanting to sort of vanquish it. I mean, the end, for instance, of Stevens' quite famous poem Sunday Morning, it's from Harmonium. It is a poem which ends with the kind of you know, downwards into darkness on extended wings. It's an allusion back to the close of Keats's To Autumn, but he talks about the quails and the deer in the mountain landscape, and he's clearly thinking, I think, of Wordsworth's account of himself as a roebuck in Tintin Abbey. So there are too many to go into. I suppose another very interesting example, perhaps someone that people don't know as well, would be someone like Gary Snyder, North American ecological poet, very influenced by Coleridge and Wordsworth in his writings and thought too. So yeah, there are many.
So you have given a list of writers. So this proves that it is one's attitude that matters the most. Whatever may be the changes, it is man's choice to stay connected with nature maybe. To the next question, sir. Your lectures on haunting and ghosts that were present in the period were an insight into the amount of supernatural demeanor the poetry of Wordsworth had. What were the facts behind the actual poem, Lucy Gray?
I'll take the last bit first, because that's relatively straightforward. We don't know very much about the facts. We do know that Wordsworth, in a letter, and of course, when we talk about Lucy Gray, I'm talking about here specifically about the poem called Lucy Gray. I mean, there are, of course, a number of poems that editors have talked about as being, you know, Some Did My Spirit Seal being another one of those, or She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, that the editors think of as the Lucy Gray poems, Lucy Gray being the poem where that figure is named as such. Wordsworth says in a letter that he was aware of a story about a girl who had gone missing in a snowstorm in West Yorkshire, outside of Halifax, and that she was believed, having been lost in the snowstorm, to have fallen into a canal. So that's the kind of, if there is a historical nugget, kernel that Wordsworth is working with, that is it. That's what he's thinking of. We know nothing else about the origin, as it were, of the facts, if they are facts, that shape Lucy Gray as a poem. The haunting and ghosts, I mean, Lucy Gray herself, of course, in that poem, by the end of it, he appears rather interestingly, doesn't she? She's a kind of, maybe a kind of voice that you hear in the wind. Perhaps maybe it's just the wind whistling. We have one of those wonderful moments where Wordsworth is sort of saying to us, some say it's this, some say it's that, and we're left to kind of somehow choose between, but we don't quite know what really is. And so she's a presence which is always evoked in the poem, but is always absent in the course of that poem. So she's very much like a kind of ghostly, spectral figure, a kind of revenant, if you will, always forever returning home, but never ever making it home, rather tragically. I'm always struck by the very opening of that poem, actually, Lucy Gray, where we're told two things. We're told that she is the sweetest thing that has ever grown by a human door. And I love this sort of suggestion that Lucy Gray is already, her subjectivity is already a thing, whereas the door, which would be the thing, is the human thing. It's almost as a kind of transferred epithet that the object has become more human and more like a subject. And Lucy Gray herself has become less like a person, less like a subject, more like a thing. It's a very interesting way of Wordsworth phrasing it in very simple, not complicated terms, but in a simple way that complicates what we then make of Lucy Gray and the story that unfolds about her and her spectral hauntings of the landscape. And there are many figures like that in Wordsworth. The discharged soldier that he encounters in his relatively young days, he's described as a kind of ghostly or ghastly figure. Michael himself, at the end of that poem I was talking about before, he tells us at one point that if his lands were to pass into a stranger's hands, he will not rest in his grave. And by the end of the poem, his lands have passed into the possession of another, and we're left with this sense that Michael, as a kind of revenant spectral figure, is left roaming the landscape. The idiot boy, of course, similarly goes on this strange, ghostly, moonlit wanderings. The boy from Renander, who dies tragically seeking out the tweeting of the owls, or the twittering of the owls. So many figures in Wordsworth that have these kinds of, what I, to steal a phrase of Wordsworth from his description of the discharged soldier, have this kind of strange half absence, that have this kind of ghostly quality or attribute to them.
So on the superficial level, though it seems to be very simple to understand, Lucy Gray has got so much to ponder about.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir. The phrase spots of time was used by Wordsworth to discuss the surfacing into present consciousness of memories of significant events. Can you elucidate this phrase, spots of time?
I can say try. I mean, we probably, as readers and as critics, identify lots of moments of spots of time, certainly in the Prelude. And there are only, I think, maybe 2 occasions, possibly 3, when Wordsworth actually calls an event a spot of time, names it as such. And I think it is about this bringing together of different temporal modes of the past and the present and the future, a kind of circular structure. So if you think of a circle as being a kind of emblem of eternity, that Wordsworth into that circular structure brings the past, present, and future. Perhaps one way of thinking about that would be to think of a poem like Tintern Abbey. Again, Wordsworth doesn't call it a spot of time, but its structure, to my mind, seems very much like one. You remember that he goes back to the Wye Valley 5 years after he's been there previously. He's looking at a scene which is a kind of both a composite of the past and present. He talks about those hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, the houseless woods. It's a kind of composite of both what the landscape once was and what it now is. It leads him into a kind of reflection about his own experience with nature, how he was once wild, like a roebuck, a young deer amongst the natural landscape, and how he's now moved to this much more mature understanding. He's now attuned not to the wilds of nature, but to the sad, still music of humanity. And this has been, the kind of the kind of moral impetus and guardianship of his life. And he closes the poem by then invoking the presence of Dorothy, thy dear sister, spirit, and a look towards the future, that Dorothy will now follow the same path, the same kind of spiritual progress that he has made, and become like him at some point in the future. So past, present, and future, kind of kaleidoscoped, if you will, into one single moment. And I think that is true of spots of time generally in Wordsworth. Talking of his friendship, as we were earlier on with Coleridge, I think it's a structure that Wordsworth is aware of Coleridge using. And if you think about Coleridge's conversation poems, for example, take Frost at Midnight or The Library Bow My Prison, you'll see that that works in a very similar kind of a way. Frost at Midnight in particular, it starts with him in solitude in the cottage with his babe Hartley in his arms. He leads him to think about his own childhood, and then it leads him to speculate about a future moment where Hartley's childhood would be different from his. And so it's a movement, you know, from a present moment into the past and then into the future again. And it moves, at least in its later version, it moves full circle. It comes back to the secret ministry of Frost, which is where the poem started. So again, we have that emblem of that kind of roundelay structure, that circle that suggests eternity, but past, present, and future compressed into that structure.
That's great indeed, sir. You've given a detailed explanation for that phrase. Francis Jeffrey wrote condemning reviews of a number of Wordsworth's poems. He claimed that Wordsworth was arrogant, irresponsible, and silly. Jeffrey found the moral of Wordsworth's poem obscure and objected to his use of diction and his lowly subject matter. Jeffrey called him hopeless Wordsworth. How do you look at it? Is it a common reaction to anything that breaks the curve and ushers in the new?
It may be. I mean, it certainly speaks. I mean, Jeffrey, as you say, in his term hopeless when applied to Wordsworth, I mean, really was suggesting in the context he uses it, that Wordsworth has a kind of poet of any merit, and a poet that should be given, you know, consideration by any critic, was a lost cause. It was hopeless. You know, why would you bother with a poet who writes about such, as you said, lowly subjects? And in such a prosaic way, very often about them, and you know, and that's as much a question of aesthetics and taste as it is perhaps political. As I said, Francis Jeffrey was very clearly of conservative Tory persuasion, and Wordsworth at this point, at least in his earlier career, was perhaps more on the radical side of the political spectrum, and then. And I think also it speaks to, I mean, one thing that always strikes me, and I think maybe Wordsworth was aware of this problem, that he was suggesting a new idea about poetry, about what was suitable for the subject of poetry, and about the modes in which poetry could be written and how poetry could be written, that he would have to kind of evoke and create in the reader this new sensibility, this new kind of taste. So I think Wordsworth was very aware that the kinds of aesthetics and poetics he was advocating would not sit very easily with the sort of established literary tastes of the day. I mean, for me, I suppose, I suppose we might turn, I mean, I think Wordsworth is not a hopeless poet, but a poet of hopelessness. I think he's very interested in, as we've seen, in going back to painful, tragic moments, seeking out, if possible, some sense of consolation in nature, and of course in the art of writing poetry for that sense of loss and hopelessness. So I mean, you could say, I suppose, in a sense, in that hopelessness, that you know, that Wordsworth finds a kind of creative impetus, a kind of spur to his poetry, that it's not, you know, this negative feeling doesn't necessarily consequently result in a failure of artistic vision as such. I mean, again, I think Shelley has Wordsworth in his mind. He very famously says it in his long lyrical drama Prometheus Unbound. He talks about the way that hope creates its own hope, or its own hopeful vision from the wreck of what it contemplates. So hope knows that it will be its own ruin and despair, but from those ruins, hope contemplates the next new hope. So hopelessness leads on to some newfound kind of hope. And I think that would be one way. I think that's a vein that Shelley's tapping into in Wordsworth. That would be one way that we might respond more positively to this charge of hopelessness that Jeffreys levels at Wordsworth.
So when you describe Wordsworth as a poet of hopelessness, It shows how you could empathize with Wordsworth exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And next question is, T.S. Eliot, who believed there is no place for real life emotion in verbal art, criticized Wordsworth for being too personal in his works. How far can you appreciate T.S. Eliot's criticism?
Well, T.S. Eliot, I mean, I suppose we need to put it in the context. I mean, Eliot levels most of these charges about the overemphasis on personality in Wordsworth, but also actually in Keats and in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, which is published in the early part of the 20th century in 1919 in the Agorist, which Eliot himself edited. And you know, I mean, Eliot, we've got to bear in mind, I mean, he's now at the vanguard of what we might think of as modernism, and he's writing his own kind of manifesto for what this new art, this new aesthetic will be. And for Eliot, I suppose he's trying to get some clear water, some distance between himself and the Romantic and the Victorians that went before him. And therefore he wants to see the writing process, I think, is something much more objective and analytic, and not driven perhaps by subjective perception and feeling as such. You remember that in that essay of Eliot's, he makes a distinction between feelings, which I think are things that we all experience, you know, our responses to the world and people around us, and what he calls emotion. And for Eliot, emotion is this kind of curiously distilled, rarefied, objectified counterpart to feeling. And the poet's job, if we believe Eliot, is to find the image that best expresses feeling in that much more distilled, rarefied form. So it seems, at least on the face of it, to be very anti-romantic and very unromantic. But actually, I mean, when I think about the way that Eliot describes this, he famously compares the creative process to a scientific experiment, one that involves a strip of platinum, which is not involved in the chemical interaction that takes place, but is a catalyst. It's neutral and impartial, but it enables these elements, if you like, around it to become something else. And that's what he sees the poet as doing, the writer is doing. So, you know, the writer is the platinum. It is involved in the process of distilling these feelings into this rarefied emotion, but it has no part in the process. So it's devoid of subjectivity. And of course, because Eliot chooses to use this register of language, which is very scientific and very empirical, we perhaps think that he's saying something very different from, say, Keats, or indeed from Wordsworth. I'm not sure that he is, actually. I mean, it's not so many miles away from Wordsworth's claim that we need to think about emotion recollected in tranquility. We need some distance from the powerful, overwhelming sense of feelings that we experience in a sublime moment. And more importantly than that, his claim that, in fact, that the creative writing process doesn't involve personality is actually a very romantic claim. Keats, after all, wrote famously in a letter to Richard Woodhouse that the poetical character is the most unpoetical of all things. It has no self. So I think maybe Eliot perhaps is pushing his claim a little bit too far, because he wants to make this dramatic distinction between his sense of aesthetics, his modernist aesthetic, and romantic sensibility. But actually, when you sort of start to unpick the way that he chooses to portray that process, well, if you think that he's just changed, if you like, the romantics thought about this process in more organic, biological kinds of terms, and he simply shifted his choice of language to something which is much more empirical and scientific. But I'm not sure the point behind it, this sense of impersonality, is in itself unromantic.
That's true, sir.
I'll stop there.
On your recent visit to Armstrong Browning Library, what was the unique piece of history that you were able to uncover regarding Wordsworth?
I'm sure it's a fabulous library. If anyone gets a chance to go, you should go. I mean, it is one of the unfound wonders, I think, of scholarship. The library itself is made of Italian marble with bronze doors engraved with the pomegranates, the emblems from Robert Browning's poetry. It is a beautiful building and has a beautiful archive and 19th century special collection. I loved it so much that I'm very pleased to say that next autumn I'm going back there for 3 months. But that doesn't answer the question. In terms of Wordsworth, one of the things that I was very lucky to see, and that they actually hold at the Armstrong Browning Library, is a letter, an unpublished letter. It's not included in Wordsworth's collected letters, in Wordsworth's hand. It's a letter that's dated the 10th of June 1834, and in all likelihood, although the postmark is missing, what we assume was written whilst Wordsworth was in residence at Rydal Mount, the house that he eventually moved to and then stayed there until his death on the 23rd of April, lived in until his death on the 23rd of April, 1770. The letter itself sees Wordsworth unfortunately complaining about troubles with his eyes and his eyesight, which in fact is something that had plagued Wordsworth for a very long time indeed. He had suffered with some kind of inflammation and irritation of the eyes from a relatively young age, and it seemed to become progressively worse the older he became. Though I mention that partly because that's the contents of the letter. It's a letter he's writing to an author called John Herod, who wrote The Judgment of the Flood, a long epic poem that an American poet that you may not know, but that's who he's writing to. And I think just the mention of the eyes and the eyesight, or Wordsworth's troubles with his eyesight, is interesting, because I think it does help corroborate the fact that he did write that letter at Rydal Mount, least of all because, as I said, that letter is dated the 10th of June 1834. The summer before that, on the 28th of August 1833, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American 19th century man of letters, visited Rydal Mount. And he writes in his account of meeting Wordsworth that he was very surprised that Wordsworth was wearing these bizarre rubber goggles with green lenses. It was quite a disturbing sight, because presumably to protect his eyes from the light. So it seems to be quite likely that, you know, within that sort of 12-month period, that the eyes are still troubling Wordsworth, and that he was, of course, in residence at Rydal Mount, and most probably therefore wrote the letter from there. So it's a wonderful thing to see. You don't often get to see a letter by a really famous 19th century poet, or indeed any famous poet, that has not been included in an edited edition of their works. So, but the library itself is worth going to see just for the building alone.
Thank you, sir. The way you have described your experience while reading the letter, I think many of the researchers would have their own plans to rush to Armstrong Browning Library immediately. So we have many questions being posted in YouTube, and you have mentioned your timing. So shall we ask our audience to come up with more questions, because they'll have a variety of questions to ask you?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with the YouTube questioner.
Yeah.
It's a question from Pavitra Pradhan. So, what's the difference between lyrical ballads and preface to lyrical ballads?
Well, lyrical ballads appears in a number of different editions, mainly 1798, 1800, and 1802. To the first edition of lyrical ballads, 1798, Wordsworth writes a short advertisement about the intentions that Coleridge and he has in producing the volume. But in the 1802 edition, Wordsworth writes a much more extended preface, setting out his ideas about poetry, about what is the suitable subject, the subject of common man, the lowly rural lives being a suitable subject for poetry, that the language of poetry can be written in something much closer to natural speech rather than elaborate, ornate poetic writing. I mean, I think Wordsworth kind of felt that the Augustan poets in particular that had come before him, people like Pope and Dryden, were more concerned with the kind of ornaments of poetry, perhaps, than they were with really getting to grips with the nature and subject of what they were writing about, and so wanted to sort of jettison overly elaborate forms of language and imagery. So I mean, that's the difference. So I mean, it's a kind of evolving process. Wordsworth is thinking, reading, in conversation with Coleridge, and his views change. I mean, perhaps most interestingly, you could go and look, for instance, at the preface he then writes to his 1815 collected poems, and look back to see how that squares or not with some of his earlier views about poetry.
Thank you, sir. There are so many Zoom participants who are waiting to post their questions. We have Ms. Subhashini. Ms. Subhashini. Can you unmute yourself? So in the meantime, we have another question from a YouTube viewer. It is Ashish Sharan. Wordsworth lived long life comparing to other romantic poets. Is this span of life a part of criticism to the critics?
I'm not sure I got the first part of that. Can you say the first part again? Sorry.
Wordsworth lived long life comparing to other romantic poets. Is this span of life a part of criticism to the critics?
That's interesting. Yes, no, I suppose. I mean, it's true that the life expectancy of an adult perhaps wasn't quite the norm of. I mean, Wordsworth, Wordsworth and Dorothy both lived good long ages. She outlived him, of course. She was 83 when Dorothy Wordsworth, his sister, passed away. That was 3 years or so after Wordsworth died at the age of 80. And it is true, I suppose, that we tend to think of the kind of archetypal romantic poet, perhaps because of the figure of Thomas Chatterton, famously depicted, in his suicidal pose on the bed as romantic poets, kind of living fast and dying young. And of course, poor Keats and Shelley did die relatively young. But Wordsworth isn't alone in living for a long period of time. William Blake lived until he was 80. So he's not alone in having that span of life. And it's interesting too that people, for instance, friends of Keats, for example, Joseph Seven, amongst them, Keats's friend, who was an artist, and indeed is responsible for getting the plaque or the engraving on the tombstone, I should say, on Keats's grave. Here lies one who's read in water. You can see Joseph Seven and others reminiscing much later on in the Victorian period about the fact that it's conceivable that Keats would still be alive, that he could have still been with them, but of course he dies of consumption so very young. So I'm not sure that Wordsworth was that unusual. I think much would depend on your quality of life, I suppose. I mean, Wordsworth, I suppose, had a reasonable quality of life and was, of course, relatively fit because of his constant explorations of the Lake District, and walking elsewhere. But it's not that unusual for people to live to quite substantial ages.
So that's great, sir. And we have this another participant from Zoom. I would like to ask Nisha Pereira to unmute yourself so that you could ask your questions to our speaker.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
I can.
Can you tell me why did Wordsworth write the preface to the lyrical ballads?
I suppose from a commercial point of view, I suppose he probably wanted to justify why was another edition of Lyrical Ballads needed? You know, I mean, I think there was that. I think he was also, of course, conscious of some of the reception that the first edition had received, and I'm sure that there are. I think that's partly why he's so concerned, as I mentioned earlier on, with the idea of creating a kind of new taste, as it were, a new sense of taste and literary sensibility in his readers, because I think he's very aware, and perhaps had more sharply brought into focus for him, how much he's standing out and against established literary taste. So I think it was partly to justify the second edition, or further edition, I should say, of Lyrical Ballads. But also, I think perhaps to sort of set out more clearly what his aesthetic principles and purposes in writing this particular collection of poems, you know, of course, with Coleridge. I mean, I suppose it speaks too to the fact he wanted to say a little bit more about the project, that the project in itself is innovative and different because it's dealing with poetry written in the language of common man. It's dealing with rural scenes of life and what might be considered lowly subjects and individuals. But it's also, of course, cutting across kind of forms of genre, because Lyrical Ballads itself as a title suggests that, yes, the lyrical mode is part of what he's doing, and the lyric and the poetic doesn't go away if you choose to write a more kind of prosaic poetry, but also that he's yoking that to a ballad, to a form that perhaps would have been thought of as perhaps a little bit more crude and rough and ready aesthetically. So he is actually trying to yoke perhaps a sense of greater poetic achievement with a more lowly poetic form. So I think all of those things he wanted perhaps to make a little bit clearer to the prospective reader, what was what his aesthetic principles were, and why he felt that there was need for this. Would have been then the third edition of Lyrical Ballads.
I have one more question. Can I ask? Hello.
Hello. Sorry, yes, I don't know where you are, but yes, you're very welcome to ask me.
What were Wordsworth's views on rustic language?
I missed the last bit. Can you say that again? Sorry.
Can you explain me, or just can you see what were Wordsworth's views on rustic language? Rustic language.
Right. Yes. It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, I suppose what he meant was, and you can see it in later poets too. I mean, Walt Whitman, William Carlos Williams in America are very interested in writing in poetry in the vernacular, essentially. That poetry and the language of poetry should reflect more accurately and be more closely aligned to the nature of its subjects, which of course Wordsworth had elected to focus on figures like Old Man Travelling, or the Old Cumberland Beggar, or the Leech Gulliver, and so on. So I think there was a feeling that would, you know, if poetry is about a deeper sympathetic, imaginative sympathetic understanding of those figures that you describe and depict, then it's sort of appropriate to find a way of voicing and expressing those kinds of consciousness, those kinds of existences in a language much more attuned to them. I think it's interesting, actually, because it's very rare that one of these kinds of figures that Wordsworth encounters in the landscape, like the discharged soldier, for example, that we actually ever hear what they have to say. It's very rare. Sometimes we might get kind of reported speech from Wordsworth. So again, it's kind of Wordsworth's interpretation. And with the discharged soldier in particular, we know that he speaks in these kinds of unutterable, almost hieroglyphical kinds of ways that only a certain person that's attuned to nature and to his being, to the discharged soul's being in the right way, can understand. So very often Wordsworth as narrator puts himself into the position of almost kind of translator, kind of transcribing and translating the words of these figures and what they have to say, rather than actually ventriloquizing or allowing them to speak on their own terms. So there's an interesting tension, I think, there between, on the one hand, wanting to find this mode of language which is more closely approximates their rustic and rural lives, and on the other hand, this sort of Wordsworth always interposing as a kind of translator or interpreter of what these figures say.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And sir, we have this question from one of our viewers from YouTube. And this is Abhita Krishnakumar, and she has asked, eco-critical frameworks tend to question Wordsworth's place in the context of eco-poetry. How do we interpret this?
Well, I mean, there's been a good deal of work done, I think, which has seen Wordsworth. I mean, Jonathan Bates' work comes to mind, of course, The Song of the Earth, that has read Wordsworth in ecological terms. And even if we don't want to see Wordsworth necessarily as a proto-ecologist, he's certainly been seen as a founding figure in what becomes, I guess, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic, in the writings of Emerson and Thoreau, environmentalism. So I mean, I do think there is a natural sort of pathway, if you like, out of Wordsworth's writing about nature and the natural world that has this ecological, environmental tendency. I mean, it's striking, actually. If you think of, for instance, I mean, Wordsworth, I mean, in his life, was very opposed, to example, of one of the plans to have a railway to the Lake District so that tourists would have easy access to Cumberland and Westmoreland, where he lived. Wordsworth was very opposed to it. I mean, he thought this was a terrible idea. Maybe he was right. I mean, it happened anyway, but he was opposed to this idea that, you know, that all and sundry could come traipsing across his beautiful Lake District and have access to it by rail. And he was also opposing the idea of, you know, of course, of the steam engine and the construction work that would come with building the railway line. So I mean, there are elements clearly of Wordsworth's life and his personal beliefs that I think would also align with kind of environmental concerns and ecological issues too. It's very interesting, actually, if you look at you know, Emerson and Thoreau, who I mentioned, you know, American famous 19th century founding American figures of literature who are clearly attuned to Wordsworth's views of nature, don't see say, for instance, railroad, as they would know them, as being, and trains as being something that's against nature. They have a view in which they see things that human beings create, technological innovations, as a natural extension of nature's web. And that's quite different from Wordsworth's view. I think Wordsworth did hold to the view that these technological changes, these more mechanized farming practices, extensions of the railways and so on, were something that were outside of, if you like, the web of nature. Whereas the Emerson and Thoreau it takes a slightly different turn, and they see human innovations, technological innovations, as being incorporated readily as part of the natural world. I mean, you see Thoreau, for instance, writing about the kind of ringing noise he hears in the telegraph lines, and he kind of incorporates that into the natural sounds of the wooded environment that he's in. So there's a difference there. But I think it's perfectly feasible to think of Wordsworth in ecological and environmental terms. And people like Jonathan Bate and James T. McCusick in his book Green Writing certainly have offered those kinds of interpretations of Wordsworth. And actually, someone like Alan Buell more recently has offered accounts of kind of ecological concerns, presentations of natural concerns in a colonial context in his recent book. So yeah, I mean, it's a very rich area of research, definitely.
Highly insightful, sir. Thank you for that. And now I would like to ask Mrs. Purnima Sree to unmute yourself and ask your question to our speaker.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sir, I would like to ask you a question. Are there traces of supernaturalism in the poem Daffodils?
Well, I suppose it depends how we define supernaturalism, doesn't it? I mean, if are you perhaps thinking of Abrams? I mean, there is. I mean, I'm not sure I would think of it as supernatural in the sense of it being necessarily ghostly or spectral. Although I suppose one could argue that the place of the daffodils continues to haunt Wordsworth's mind, if you wanted to think of it in that way. I think I would take supernatural there in the sense of the word super to mean supra, as in something that is over and above nature. So it is the sight of the daffodils that, on reflection, that when Wordsworth is at rest and attaining his tranquility laid on his couch, as it were, that he starts to see a kind of transcendental vision that the sight, the amazing host of those golden daffodils, gives him access to on further reflection and meditation. So super in that sense, over and above nature, but not perhaps supernatural in the ghostly sense, unless we see simply that vision, that haunt of daffodils haunting Wordsworth's mind subsequently.
Well said, sir. And now I would like to ask the last participant from Zoom to come up with your question for our speaker. And I would like to ask Mr. Srikanth to unmute yourself and direct your questions to Professor Mark Sandy.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Professor.
Hello.
Yeah, I have been following your answers and explanation. It is really wonderful. I am coming with a question regarding my further research. That is between noumenon and phenomenon. Between noumenon and phenomenon, silence in the contemporary eco-poetics of transcendence. With this title, which poets can I choose to research on eco-poetics of transcendence after modernist poets? After modernist poets, I mean the contemporary poets, like for example Sree and Tracy K. Smith, like that. Some poets, could you suggest me on these topics between the noumenon and phenomenon? Silence in the contemporary eco-poetics of transcendence.
Well, one I've already mentioned, I think might be of interest to you, would be someone like Gary Snyder. I mean, one of the Black Mountain poets.
Yeah,
I mean, he's North American, of course, but
wonderful poet.
I mean, I think I would have thought Snyder's work and maybe some of his contemporaries would be of interest to you. Trying to think who else would fit into that. I mean, it's a very specific kind of defined niche, isn't it? That you're looking for. Who else might? Who else might? I mean, you don't want modernists though. You want postmodernists, don't you? After modern.
Contemporary writers. Contemporary writers. The writers who are seen in poetry magazines, Shivani Review, and these magazines. Most contemporary. And do you think anybody carrying that kind of transcendental tradition of Wordsworth and Coleridge at the very present state of affairs? I mean, in the eco-poetic scenario and even post-natural scenario, environmentalist poetry.
Not that comes to mind. I mean, I suppose I'm not sure if poets think. I mean, quite in that way. I mean, I think poets are poets foremost, aren't they? And then, I think sometimes these labels, these ways of interpreting and responding to them become attached to them, if that makes sense. I mean, I don't think you necessarily sit down to write a poem and think, oh, I'm going to be an eco-poetic poet operating between the phenomena and the noumena, and especially going to foreground silence, if you see what I mean. I mean, that doesn't seem to me a good way of going about writing a poem. I'm having difficulty thinking of others. I mean, who are you working on? I mean, do you have, who are your figures that you're working on?
Okay.
Sorry, I mean, I was going to say to you, which poets are you looking at the moment?
Yeah, I'm looking. I've taken Seamus Heaney and
absolutely.
Charles Simic, and Olson, and
Charles Olson,
Susan Stewart, Jory Graham.
Well, Ted Hughes. I mean, I suppose Ted Hughes maybe. Ted Hughes may be someone interesting to look at. I mean, Ted Hughes. If you read his essay on myth and education, which I think was published in the early 70s, he has lots of interesting things to say that I think are very kind of attuned to kind of Wordsworth and Coleridge's ideas about the relationship between the subject and the object, particularly between self and world, that are, as you would put it, kind of Coleridgean and transcendental.
But I still wonder whether we can take Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes in the list of contemporary poetry.
Well, it's not
contemporary poets. Just contemporary poets who are writing and whose influence have now passed on to the contemporary writers. That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. I'm not sure I can say. I'm just trying to think about other really sort of. I mean, obviously, Sylvia Plath, when's her last poem? 2nd of February 1961. So it's not, it's very late 20th century.
Okay.
I mean, you see what I mean? I mean, she's not, she's kind of beyond, the strict definition of modernism.
Okay.
I mean, actually, I think Plath would be wonderfully interesting, but not so much the poems that she's famous for, but some of her earlier poetry, actually. Some of those, Dark Wood, Dark Water, for example, those kinds of poems. That very early poem of hers, Winter Landscape with Rooks, for example, would be really interesting in terms of subjectivity and nature and kind of psychometric landscapes and so on. I think would be interesting. Don't know if anyone's done that actually. And she's a poet actually. Now you've put Plath into my mind. Who I think is very much responding to Wordsworth. There's a great poem of hers, which I'm sure you know, Blackberrying, where she goes out and to press the blackberries into the milk bottle and she gathers them. And I'm sure that poem is a response to Wordsworth's Nutting, actually.
Okay, Notting. I have to read it. That's a good information for me. Thank you.
Well, good luck with the research.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, great questions and brilliant answers. And today you have answered so many questions for us so patiently. And now we come to the end of the session, but not the least. This will be the time where Professor Mark Sandy will be announcing the winners of the poetry contest that we have announced a few weeks before. And now I would like to ask, excuse me, sir, I think you have to unmute yourself a bit.
There we are.
Oh, yes. Great, sir. And now the participants from Zoom, I think the winning poets are live with us. And I would like to ask you to read your poems when your name is read out. And do a good job because you have already done a great job winning the poetry contest amidst 1,200 entries from all over the world. And I would like to request Professor Mark Sandy to read the names from the last place, I mean the 5th place, so that we could,
Right, in reverse order.
So that we could hold the element of suspense.
Element of suspense. Okay, you may have to help me with some of the names, Sakthi, if you don't mind.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
If that's all right. Now, our first honourable mention, at least, is Danush Sakin. Am I saying that correctly?
More or less, sir. Danush Sachin.
Sachin, right. Thank you.
Right. So, Mr. Danush
for a poem called Immaculate Death.
Yeah, am I audible right now?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, good evening, everyone. Today I would like to read my poem Immaculate Death. So I would start off. Awake. At the crack of dawn, they descend in numbers. Ravenous ravens yell out to us. Their thunderous necks all bellied out, perched atop frigid hills and parched lakes. feverish quiverings of their airy wings, mourn for the death of natural beauty. Destiny draws ire for its ill-fated children. Resting in high places, fat legs rest. Sorry, my earbud fell off. Yeah. Resting in high places, fat legs rest easy upon clouds. We have forsaken our mother of birth, shaven her head and stabbed her in the mouth, stripped her and scorched her delicate skin. Beauty now recedes at our very touch. She hides herself in the deep confines of barbed shrubs made of her eyelashes, where no mortal could question her authority. The bawling rabbit screams signal the end of times for sleeping minds. No more bites into nature's thighs. Worry not, for we have gained her onto our screens. Yeah, that's about it.
It's a wonderful poem. It makes me think of, I don't know if you know, it's a poem I mentioned, Wallace Stevens on Sunday Morning. He has a wonderful line towards the end of it where he says that death is the mother of all beauty. You might enjoy looking at that poem.
Yeah, what was that again?
It's Sunday Morning, and the poet is Wallace Stevens, Stevens. Death is the mother of all beauty.
Yeah, I got that. Thank you.
Great. And next, I may definitely need some help here with the surname in particular.
Okay,
DT is the first name, but the surname, I would be grateful for your help.
Just a moment, sir. Aditi Abhishekita.
Shitika. And this is in the canvas of green is the poem, isn't it?
Nice. So, Dr. Aditi Abhishekita.
Yeah, good evening, one and all. Am I audible?
Yes, you
yes,
are.
ma'am, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you. This is very good evening to one and all. I am Dr. Aditi Abhishekta, and here goes the poem like this. In the canvas of green, beneath rays of hope, promises sanguine serene, I am born again at every dawn's beam and redeem. Rejoicing at the spirit of soulful green, its charismatic mist, women's evinced, recounting in nature's feast. Cleansing eyelids with gentle stroke of winds, pouring smiles from running down streams. I wonder and recall, connecting the dots, the days bygone of autumns and springs. The air was pure, fresh, and tranquil. The land was rich in creepers and seeds. The earth and heaven, so bright and crystal, had hardly sign of little, alas, greed of man, power and possession. Behold remorse in losing the innocence of hills, fountains and woods, the nectar of heath, warmth in forbearance. The land turned barren, life pale and feeble, left any space for vines to muzzle. None gave heed to my cry when I crawled and wriggled to show my face to the world. I want to live and give life to you, says the voice from the heart of the seed. Allow me to grow, embrace grin upon you, and let my shade relieve pain from you. Man and nature is but mother and child. Together we bloom, but departed we fall. Beneath rays of hope, promises sanguine serene, I am born again at every dawn's beam and rebeam. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Do you know John Clare's poetry, romantic poet? John Clare talks about, he has this wonderful line, he talks about the language that is evergreen. He's talking about the way in which nature kind of, he wants to close down the distinction between kind of our kind of artificial or cultural response to nature and natural process. and he talks about the way in which poetic language is evergreen, that he doesn't really write poetry, he simply exists as a kind of being in presence with nature. And he's a poet who moves away from Helpston, the village that he lived in for much of his life. And he writes this wonderful moving poem called The Flitting, and in being displaced, he feels as if the landscape no longer talks to him anymore or can console him, because he doesn't recognize in all of its detail the landscape in which he ends up in. So you know, if you don't know John Clare, I think you would enjoy him.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarkable inputs and remarks. Thank you, sir.
So we're moving up, aren't we? Are we into the top three now?
Yes,
am I allowed to say that?
It's the top three.
Oh, good, good. And this is Vidi Bansu. Have I got that right?
So I would like to call Vidhi Basu, so to unmute yourself and recite your poem now.
Hey, can you all hear me? I am Vidhi Basu. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, ma'am, you're visible. You're audible.
Hey, my poem is titled Lines Written Under a Hilltop Tree. Very self-explanatory. I'm a little nervous, sorry.
Oh, don't worry.
Here the poem goes. Eternal pines reaching for a grey sky, wearing a soft coat of the greenest moss. On their necks rest nests of birds that far fly. Listen hard, and you hear the peacocks cry. Rain glints like the emerald city of Oz, and the cushioned ground smells of petrichor. The sights give the hardest of hearts a pause and make a poet burst into applause. The dusk blushes in a shade I adore as the peeping fowl flock back to their nests like a scene from a book of myth and lore, and the flora is in for aesthetic decor. So you understand why what I like best won't ever be money or treasure chest, but a shady tree under which to rest, as Mother Nature's silly little guest. Thank you.
Beautiful. It's very Wordsworthian. I don't know if you had Wordsworth in your mind when you wrote it, did you? It makes me think of that wonderful poem that he writes dedicated to Dorothy, you know, lines written in early April, where he talks about going out and abandoning the world of books to go and read the lessons in the natural world in the springtime.
Sir, in fact, this is more after I read Alfred Lord Tennyson. This was written immediately after I read that. So.
Oh, which poem?
The River.
Well, Tennyson, you know, I'm sure there was a legacy of Wordsworth in Tennyson.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Oh, so where are we? So we are moving up, aren't we? To now, can I say, almost pole position, but not quite. But nonetheless, a great poem. A poem called "The Dreadful Wave." I may need some help with the first name, though. I'm afraid. Mishra is the surname, is it?
Mishra.
Yeah, but how? What about the first name? I'm not sure. Ayash. I'm not sure how to say that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So I think Mrs. Mishra is not available at the moment right now.
Oh, so we will have to pass on the Dreadful Wave. Oh dear,
oh, yes.
That's a shame. Should we move to
the first place?
First place.
Nice.
Without further ado.
Hello, am I audible? I actually heard the surname Mishra, but I'm not sure about the name. Yeah, Chandrima Mishra.
Excuse me.
So we had a slight confusion with the names, that's all.
there's always someone that has a similar name. In my case, I was up being called Sandy and not Mark. Names are confusing. Don't worry. Shall we move then?
Excuse me. Excuse me, sir. I'm there, Chandan Mishra.
Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt. The second position goes to Aishwarya Mishra. Aishwarya Mishra of Odisha. And I was not able to reach her this noon because her phone was switched off. So I don't think she'll be available in Zoom. Is there anybody named Aishwarya Mishra from Odisha? So I request her to come out with the name of the most expected winner.
Yes, indeed. I have it as A. Regina Banu with a poem called A Worthy Scholar.
I request Ms. Regina to unmute herself. Ms. Regina, I request you to unmute yourself and present your poem, the prize-winning poem.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Hello, good evening to all. First of all, I wish to register my heartfelt thanks to the organizing team and Dr. Shasikala ma'am in particular for conducting this wonderful program that must have made many to think like poets. Nothing is valuable until it meets the eyes that value. I feel unspeakable joy to know that my poem is appreciated by learned community like that of yours. I am here to recite my poem titled A Worthy Scholar. A Worthy Scholar. Let thy little bit rest. Lend your heart to nature's spirit, who never spills her secrets in mortal tongues. Hone thine earth to hearken her lays. Bend before the mighty queen to learn her covert ways. Praise her grace like a priest and spy out her being in silence. Sit and muse upon her steps amidst the bosky banks. Feel her touch in the mellowy moon and sun. Espy her ever elegant features and immerse thyself in her seductive chords. To be diesel in its virtue, unbeknownst to all. Never fall for her glamorous viands, for far beyond is the poetic vision. Creators thee deified today are among the best. You must be patient to be in tomorrow's list. Immortalize thy learned art in words, to eternalize thyself as a worthy scholar of hers. Immortalize thy learned art in words, to eternalize thyself as a worthy scholar of hers. Thank you.
Thanks. It's wonderful. I mean, there's certainly.
So, thank you, sir. Actually, we had meant this webinar and the poem writing competition for the adults, but we had so many budding poets from school level. So we didn't want to mingle both. So we sorted it out in a different way, and we have sorted out school students separately. And we are here giving them 3 prizes, 3 certificates. I request you to announce the person who has secured the 3rd position.
Me. Sorry, in the list that we have.
Sir?
You mean Vidi Bansu? Is that who you mean?
Ma'am, I could not hear the last part. Could you repeat it? Oh, this is Vidhi.
It's actually the prize winners for the school level.
I don't have those.
Sir?
I think you'll have to. I don't have those. I only have the top 5.
Sir, we have sent a mail to you.
I
Okay,
don't
sir.
have
Okay,
them.
okay. The 3rd prize goes to Mahi Ajmani. Mahi Ajmani.
Yes.
Can you unmute yourself and recite your poem? A bit faster, please. We are running short of time. Miss Mahi
I was
Ajmani.
sad and wanted motivation. Yes, I'm speaking right now.
Yeah, you're visible. You could start reciting your poem.
I was sad and wanted motivation, which I did not get from any human relation. I went outside and sat on my terrace because I didn't want to be embarrassed. The sky was clear and I felt the clouds were near. The trees gave me a motherly smile. I felt behold by nature's beauty. I heard the voice of console mutely. I felt the pat of console from the leaves falling. This made me think that my wound is curing. The dancing shadows of the clouds made me laugh and bow. Everything felt like an illusion because I didn't want to come at the conclusion. A hug from nature vanished my sobs of pain from these creatures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahi. May I now announce the second prize winner, Miss Yuktamani Palmer. Miss Yuktamani, kindly unmute yourself and present your poem.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
So here goes the poem, Letter to the Creator. Letter to the Creation, sorry. When my internal peace was shattered, your chilling wind cheered me up. When I lost hope and gave up in despair, your rising sun taught me to aspire. When I could just not hold the pain inside me, your clouds wept to unleash my pain. When I felt it was all muddled up, your trees in autumn consoled me to shed away the pain and begin new. When I danced up in glee, your waves on the shore complimented my steps. I yearned if I could love you back as you do. I crave if I could hold your beauty forever. I desire if I could make every soul understand that you do feel and respond to feelings. I desire that if I could make every soul understand that you do feel and respond to feelings. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And now it's time to announce the winner of the school level competition. It is Sree. Sree, can you unmute yourself and present your poem?
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am Rajasi Rajeshwari, 13 years of age, studying in St. Xavier School, Nepta. Before I begin my poem, I would like to greet each one of you and extend my deepest gratitude to the Kamraj College fraternity, the jury members, and Professor Mark Sandy. Here goes my poem. It is titled That Night. In the shade of giant trees that clasped their leaves close and pressed, I stood one night in a forest, listening to the songs of herons distressed. Submerged in the moonlight that shone brighter than the silver threads, I stood one strange night in a forest, walking the endless soily beds, clasped by the gloom of autumn that reigned. In each leaf my feet crushed, I stood one strange night in a forest, waiting for the panther's growl so hushed. One strange night in a forest will I sleep, neath the stars, in the mysteries of the deep. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have officially come to the end of the session. And I would like to point out the fact that what we have done here today is nothing but a perfect engraving in the pages of history regarding the studies that go along with the research that comes on the topic of Wordsworth and the Romantic Age. And what has Professor Mark Sandy has given today is nothing less of perfection. And I would like to thank him personally for accepting our request and considering our college. And I could see that he was enjoying all the poetry that was recited. And our young poets, as well as our striving poets, were all happy that they could recite their poem in public like this. And I would like to offer the chair back to Professor Mark Sandy to give the final notes of his session.
Well, I'd like to thank our host for organising this magnificent event. I very much enjoyed all of the poems that I heard, and I thought each and every one of them engaged in varying ways with what I would think of as a legacy of Romanticism. Some of it Wordsworthian, perhaps in vein, some of it more perhaps Emersonian or Whitman-esque, but nonetheless, I think a true testament to the presence of Romanticism, even in this contemporary moment. And I mean, Wordsworth, of course, himself worried at various points, particularly later in his career, that perhaps his reputation wasn't established and that perhaps he wouldn't have a lasting legacy, a little revived perhaps by success with the American edition of his poems in the 1840s. But I think, as the narrator of Michael puts it, that he hopes that the reader of that poem will become my second self, and you will tell of me when I am gone. And I think what we've seen today is testament to the fact that Wordsworth's legacy 250 years after his death is strongly alive and very much in the hearts and minds of many readers globally, not just in the United Kingdom. And I think Wordsworth would have been very pleased indeed. I think the sage of Rydalmount would have been very satisfied to know that people were still thinking and reading and talking about his poetry about such modest subjects and expressed in such modest ways. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, sir. And now we have come to the end of the session, but with regard to all the poets that have been submitted in light of this contest, we deemed that some poems were so remarkable that they could not be just ignored, right, in this occasion. So I'd like to ask Dr. B. Shasikala to recite the names of those poets whom we think that the special mention is something that is indebted.
Thank you, Prem. Actually, it was an overwhelming response. We expected around 200 to 300 poems, but we got 1,200 and odd. It was really a huge number for us to evaluate. We had to look for judges to evaluate within a day. So almost 22 judges across the world have evaluated your work, and they had a tough time to decide the winner, the best 5, the best 3, and so on. And here are certain points which are worth mentioning. Miss Tejashwini Madhav Kudwa, Shades of Equality, student of grade 12, Ramnivas Junior College, Mumbai, Maharashtra, India. A poem was so special. And Miss Fawzia Islam Ira, The Lost Bloom, a student, Vikaraniza Noon School and College, Dhaka, Bangladesh. Miss Mayumi Mani, I Wish I Could Disappear, a student, IISJ, Jeddah from Saudi Arabia. Dr. R. Uday Banu, Nature's Wrath, retired associate professor, University Technology, MARA, Perak, Malaysia. And Miss Frija Bharadwaj, born again, a student from Vasanta College for Women. So it was a very difficult task for the judges to evaluate and find out the best poem. So we didn't know what we want to do justice to all the poets who had contributed. So we have decided that we would publish it in our college website. We have a college magazine called Kahita Kural. So we have decided that our management has been magnanimous enough to give us permission to publish all the works that we have received. The 1,200 and odd poems that we have received today will be published. So that indeed would be the honor that we could give to all the participants who have taken the initiative to contribute something creatively. Thank you.
Well said, ma'am. Now, to give this webinar an official ending, I would like to ask Ms. L. Suganti, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Kamaraj College, to give us a vote of thanks.
Good evening, all. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of Kamaraj College, Department of English, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the honorable delegates who blessed us with their presence and took out valuable time of your busy schedule. I thank our chief guest and resource person, Mr. Mark Anthony, Max Stanley. We are really enlightened with your knowledge and presence. I especially thank our chief guest and resource person, Mr. Daniel David. The way you explain the topic is exemplary. Thank you, sir. We are thankful to Honorable Founder President and Secretary for their motivation. I also wish to express my gratitude to our principal, Mr. Naharajan, for providing encouragement and support. I am very grateful to Dr. Tony Melvin, Director of SF Stream, for giving us an opportunity to organize this event. A special thanks to the organizing committee members, Dr. Shasikala and Mr. Shakti Prem. I thank our superintendent, Mr. Saravanan, for his technical support. I also thank Mrs. Andal from Computer Science for her technical support and coordination. I heartily congratulate to all the winners and all the participants for their active participation on this webinar. As no program can become successful with a single person, so I extend my big thanks to our department members for their support. Thank you all for making this webinar successful with your contribution. Thank you.